She stood on that platform clutching a wooden trunk with both hands while the man who had written her 14 letters turned his horse around and rode away without saying a single word. The whole town saw it, every last one of them, and not one person stepped forward. Eleanor Whitaker had crossed 900 miles to build a life, and in 30 seconds in front of everyone, she was thrown away like she had never mattered at all. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The train had not even come to a full stop when Eleanor felt it. That particular stillness that descends over a crowd right before it decides what kind of story it is watching. She had felt it before in church pews when she walked in late, in mercantile shops when women glanced sideways at each other, in the faces of men who looked at her and immediately looked somewhere else. It was not hostility exactly, it was something quieter and far more devastating than hostility. It was the moment a group of people made a collective wordless decision that a person was not worth their attention. Eleanor Whitaker had spent 29 years learning to breathe through that feeling. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass and looked out at Willow Creek, Colorado territory, and told herself what her mother had told her every single morning for as long as she could remember. You are not what they see when they look at you, Ellie. You are what you do when nobody is watching. She picked up her trunk. It was not a heavy trunk by any measure, but it held everything she owned in the world: 2 dresses, a winter shawl, her mother's Bible, a small tin of dried lavender, and 14 letters tied with a piece of brown twine. 14 letters from a man named Caleb Whitmore, a rancher outside a town called Willow Creek who had written to a Chicago matrimonial agency 6 months prior, describing himself as a hard-working, honest, God-fearing man who was looking not for beauty but for character. Those were his words, character. He had written that word in the very first letter, and Eleanor had read it so many times the paper had softened at the fold. She had read it to herself in her small rented room in Chicago. She had read it to her mother's grave the morning she packed her trunk and bought her train ticket. She had read it on the platform in Kansas City when doubt crept in and told her to turn around. Character, she believed him. She had spent her whole life being told that what she carried inside her was worth more than what anyone could see from the outside, and here, finally, was a man who had put that belief into writing and signed his name beneath it. The train exhaled its great cloud of steam, and Eleanor descended the steps onto the Willow Creek platform with her trunk in both hands and her heart doing something she had not let it do in a very long time. Hoping. She saw him immediately. She knew it was him because the photograph he had sent a serious-faced man with dark hair and the kind of jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the mountains behind him matched the man. Sitting on horseback at the far end of the platform. He was exactly as he had described himself, broad shoulders, working hands, a hat worn low over eyes that she could not quite read from this distance. He was watching the train. He was watching the passengers descend. Eleanor set her trunk down for just a moment to straighten her dress, and in that brief pause she saw the exact instant he found her in the crowd. She saw it because his face changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was not a snarl or a visible recoil or anything that could be pointed to later as cruelty. It was subtler than that and far worse for being so. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved over her once slowly, the way a man reads something he was not expecting. Something that contradicts what he was told. The hope that had been sitting loosely in his expression, she could see it clearly even from 15 feet away, packed itself up and left without ceremony. He looked at her once, then he turned his horse and he rode away. No word, no gesture, no acknowledgement that she was a living person standing on a train platform in an unfamiliar town with a trunk full of everything she owned and not a single soul to turn to. He simply decided in the span of one glance that she was not what he wanted. And he left. The platform went quiet in the particular way that crowds go quiet when they have witnessed something that embarrasses them, but entertains them slightly more than it embarrasses them. Eleanor heard the whispers begin before the hoofbeats faded. Is that her Lord I'd have ridden off to? Poor thing. Did she really think? Eleanor did not move for a long moment. She stood with her hand resting on the lid of her trunk and her eyes fixed on the empty end of the platform, where a man on a horse had just taken her future and ridden it into the dust. She was aware of being looked at. She was always aware of being looked at. It was one of the first things a woman with her body learned, how to exist inside a crowd that had already decided what it thought of her before she opened her mouth. She breathed in, she breathed out, she picked up her trunk. A woman near the station door laughed a small, mean sound, quickly covered by a cough, and Eleanor walked past her without turning her head. She did not cry. Not then, not on the platform in front of 17 strangers who were already composing the story they would tell at supper that evening. She had learned long ago that crying in public was a gift you gave to people who wanted to watch you suffer. And Eleanor Whitaker had never been in the business of giving gifts to people who had not earned them. She walked into the train station, set her trunk against the wall, and sat down on a wooden bench. And then she allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to fall apart. She pressed her hands flat against her knees. She stared at the floor. She thought about the 900 miles. She thought about the 14 letters. She thought about the word character, written in a man's careful handwriting, and how she had believed it the way a drowning woman believes in a rope. She thought about her mother's voice, and then the 5 minutes were over. She picked up her trunk and walked to the ticket window. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "Is there a boarding house in this town?" The man behind the window looked at her the way people in Willow Creek had apparently already learned to look at Eleanor Whitaker, with a particular blend of pity and dismissal that told her the story of what had happened on the platform had already begun its travels through the town's social network. "Margaret Linwood runs a place on 2nd Street, he said after a pause. "She's particular about who she takes in." "Thank you," Eleanor said. She walked out into the afternoon sun of Willow Creek, Colorado territory, with nowhere to go, almost no money, and no plan beyond the next 5 minutes. But she was still walking. That counted for something. Margaret Linwood's boarding house was a 2-story building painted white, which in this dust-colored town made it look almost startlingly clean. Eleanor stood at the front door with her trunk at her feet and knocked, and when the door opened, she found herself looking at a woman of about 60 with silver hair, sharp blue eyes, and an expression that had clearly spent decades deciding things quickly and rarely revising those decisions. Margaret looked at Eleanor. She looked at the trunk. She looked at the dust on Eleanor's traveling dress and the particular quality of Eleanor's expression. Not broken, not defeated, but doing the careful, controlled work of not being broken or defeated. "I heard about the platform," Margaret said without preamble. "I suspected you might have," Eleanor said. "Come in," said Margaret. It was not warmth exactly. It was something more practical than warmth. But Eleanor recognized it for what it was. A door opening when all the others had remained closed, and she picked up her trunk and walked through it. The room Margaret showed her was small. A single bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the alley beside the building. It smelled like lye soap and dried sage. It was the most welcoming room Eleanor had seen since leaving Chicago. "I can't pay much," Eleanor said. "I have to be honest with you about that." "I know," Margaret crossed her arms. "What can you do?" "Cook, clean, launder, mend. I'm good with accounts and I learn fast." Margaret studied her for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. "The room is yours for now," she said at last. "We'll work out the particulars." She turned to leave, then stopped in the doorway. "You should know," she said, not turning around, "that Caleb Whitmore is not a bad man." Eleanor said nothing. "He is a man who has been through things that broke the better part of him," Margaret continued. "That doesn't excuse what he did today. Nothing excuses what he did today. But I thought you should know, since you came a long way because of him." "I came a long way because of what he wrote," Eleanor said. "Those aren't necessarily the same thing." Margaret turned and looked at her then, and something in the older woman's expression shifted. "No," she said quietly. "I suppose they're not." She left Eleanor alone in the small room. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and opened her trunk and took out the 14 letters. She held them in her lap for a moment, the brown twine still wound around them, and then she set them on the washstand and began unpacking the rest of her belongings. She did not read them again. She was practical enough to understand that the letters belonged to a story that had already ended. Whatever came next would need to be written from a different beginning. The next 3 days, Eleanor learned Willow Creek. She helped Margaret in the kitchen and the laundry, and she listened more than she spoke, which was how she had always learned best. The town was not large, perhaps 400 souls spread between the main street and the outlying ranches, and it had the particular social texture of small frontier towns, which was to say that everyone knew everything about everyone else, and the knowing was never kind. She learned that Willow Creek had a general store run by a man named Holt, who extended credit to almost no one, a saloon that did more business than the church, a church whose preacher was more interested in appearances than souls, and a collection of surrounding ranches that formed the town's real economic foundation. She learned that Whitmore Ranch had once been the most successful of those ranches. And she learned, piece by piece and source by source, what had happened to it. Caleb Whitmore had inherited the land from his father, a first-generation rancher who had built the property from nothing and left it to his only son in decent shape. Caleb had managed it well for a number of years, had even expanded it slightly, had done the kind of steady, unglamorous work that keeps a working ranch alive in the territory. He had married a woman named Clara who had come from back east and who had lasted 4 years before deciding that frontier life was not what she'd imagined it would be. She simply left, took a train east one morning in January and sent papers from Denver 6 weeks later. The town, in the way of small towns, had opinions about this. Some sympathized with Caleb, some felt Clara had her reasons and kept their thoughts on those reasons private. All of them watched Caleb's ranch with the particular attention that people in hard country pay to a neighbor's misfortune, partly from genuine concern and partly from the ancient, uncomfortable awareness that misfortune was contagious. The injury happened 8 months after Clara left. Caleb had been riding out to check the fence line during a storm, the kind of stubborn, unwise decision that exhausted. Lonely men make when they have spent too long working without anyone to tell them to sit down, and his horse had gone down on the muddy ground. Caleb went with it. His right arm hit a fence post. The wound was deep, and in the weeks that followed, without anyone to tend it properly, it had gone bad. The hands had left. Couldn't keep working without proper payment, and payment required cattle sales, and the cattle had scattered during the storm and hadn't been properly gathered back. The debts had piled the way debts do when a man is down quickly, and with interest. By the time Eleanor arrived in Willow Creek, Whitmore Ranch was less a working property than a slow disaster. And Caleb Whitmore was less a man than a man-shaped collection of fever and pride, and the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided that dying alone was better than asking for help. Eleanor heard all of this in pieces, from Margaret, who said less than she knew but said it carefully. From a woman at the laundry who talked without thinking. From the general store where she went to price supplies she couldn't yet afford. She assembled the pieces the way she assembled everything in her life, methodically, without drama, with attention to what the pieces meant rather than just what they said. On the 4th morning she put on her second dress, the better one, and told Margaret she was going to walk out to the Whitmore property. Margaret set down her coffee cup. "You understand what you're walking into," she said. It was not a question. "A dying man and a dying ranch," Eleanor said. "Is what I need." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "What you need," she repeated slowly. "I need work," Eleanor said. "I need a place that needs what I can give. And from everything I've heard, that ranch needs every single thing I know how to do." She picked up her shawl from the chair. "So yes, I understand what I'm walking into." "He will not be glad to see you," Margaret said. "I'm not walking out there to be seen," Eleanor said. "I'm walking out there to work." She tied her shawl and walked out the door. The road to Whitmore Ranch was 5 miles of dusty track that wound through scrub brush and rocky ground and climbed slightly before it descended toward the valley where the ranch buildings sat. Eleanor walked all of it. She was not a woman who rode, and there was no horse offered to her, and the walking suited her anyway because it gave her time to manage the particular combination of fear and determination that was driving her forward. She was afraid. She wanted to be clear about that with herself at least, even if she had no intention of showing it to anyone else. She was afraid of what she would find, afraid of how he would react, afraid of whether she was doing something brave or something desperate that she was only calling brave to make it easier to keep moving. But she kept moving because she had nowhere else to go. And because, under the fear and the practicality and the careful self-control, there was something else. Something she did not quite name, a recognition maybe. A sense that the story being told about Caleb Whitmore, the finished man, the broken-down failure, the cowboy everyone had quietly given up on, was a story she had heard before. In different words, about a different person, about herself. She had been given up on before she even stepped off the train. She knew what it felt like to be a story other people finished for you. She arrived at Whitmore Ranch in the late morning. The yard was a ruin, that was the only word for it. Fences down or listing badly, a water trough cracked and dry. Outbuildings with doors hanging open, a kitchen garden that had not been tended since she could tell by the weeds at least midsummer. The barn doors were swayed on one broken hinge and moved slowly in the wind with a sound that was less a creak than a groan. Eleanor walked past all of it to the main house. The door was unlocked. In the territories, doors were rarely locked. Hospitality was law, more or less, though it cost you less to observe it when you had something to protect. She knocked anyway, no answer. She pushed the door open. The smell hit her first, the particular smell of a space where a sick person has been living alone for too long. Unwashed linen, spoiled food, the metallic trace of fever sweat. She stood in the doorway until her eyes adjusted from the bright day outside, and then she saw him. Caleb Whitmore was lying on a cot against the far wall of the main room, which was also the kitchen, which was also in a state of remarkable disorder. He was covered with a blanket, despite the heat of the morning, and his face, even from the doorway, had the particular flushed pallor of sustained fever. His arm was wrapped in bandaging that had not been changed in far too long, Eleanor could tell by the color of it. He was awake, barely. His eyes were open and tracking the doorway, and they found her immediately, and the look in them was not anger or surprise so much as a bone-deep resignation that was somehow worse than either of those things. "Get out," he said. His voice was a ruin too, cracked and low and stripped of whatever authority it had once carried. Eleanor stepped inside. "No," she said. He blinked. Whatever he had expected her to say, it was not that. "I said get out." There was more force in it this time, but force and strength were not the same thing, and she could hear that clearly. "I heard you," Eleanor said. She set her shawl on the nearest clean surface a windowsill and looked around the room, cataloging, organizing. There was water in the bucket by the stove, though it needed replacing. The stove itself was cold. "I'm going to light the stove," she said. "And then I'm going to see about that arm. Who the hell are you to come in here?" "Eleanor Whitaker," she said, "though you know who I am." A pause. "You need to go," he said, but the command had gone out of it. "Mr. Whitmore." She turned and looked at him directly, and she let him see her, all of her, the face he had looked at and turned from on the platform, the body he had judged in 1 second and dismissed, and she looked back at him with the same directness. "You are running a fever that will kill you if it isn't brought down. Your bandaging needs to be changed, or you will lose that arm. Your stove is cold and there is no food cooking, and you have not, I would guess, eaten properly in several days." He said nothing. "I am not here because I have illusions about what happened at the station," she continued. "I don't have illusions about much of anything. I am here because I need work and you need help, and if we can set aside everything else for the length of time it takes to keep you from dying, then that would suit us both a great deal better than the alternative." Silence. The broken door of the barn groaned in the wind outside. "I don't need charity?" She raised her chin slightly. "I'm not offering charity, Mr. Whitmore. I'm offering a transaction. I keep you alive. You let me stay until I find proper work." That is an exchange of services, nothing more. He looked at her. She looked back. She did not look away. He was the one who looked away first. The bandaging is from a kit in the box under the cot, he said, after a moment that felt much longer than it was. There's not much left in it. I'll manage, Eleanor said, and she turned back to the stove. What happened in the next 2 hours was not dramatic, which was perhaps the most dramatic thing about it. Eleanor Whitaker moved through that wrecked kitchen with the focused efficiency of a woman who had learned to work without waste, because waste was something she had never been able to afford. She lit the stove. She found the water bucket and replaced the water. There was a well in the yard that was still functional if she primed it for longer than it should have needed. She found what food there was, not much but enough, and she set something on to heat. She opened 2 windows to clear the air. Then she sat on a stool beside Caleb's cot, and she unwrapped his arm. He made a sound when the bandage came free. Not a cry. She did not think this man had cried in front of another person in many years, but a sharp exhale through his teeth that told her exactly how bad it was before she saw it. It was bad. She had seen infections before. Her mother had kept her when she was small in a tenement building in Chicago, where the neighbors were too poor for doctors and too proud for charity, and she had watched her mother tend wounds and fevers and all manner of things that should have been handled by a physician but weren't. She knew what an infection looked like when it had been fought with nothing but a sick man's stubbornness and time, and she knew the difference between bad and past saving. This was bad. It was not past saving. Has anyone looked at this? She asked, keeping her voice even. Doc Henry's came out 2 weeks ago, Caleb said. He was watching her face, she realized. Watching it the way a man watches the face of someone who is about to deliver a verdict he is afraid of. Said it might need to come off, and you said? I told him to go to hell. Eleanor looked at the wound and then at Caleb's face and then back at the wound. I'm not going to tell you to go to hell, she said. I'm going to tell you that you need to let me clean this properly and redress it, and you need to stop being too proud to eat and sleep. She reached into the medical kit. Can you do that? He was quiet for a moment. It's going to hurt, he said. Not a protest, almost like he was warning her. I know, she said. Do you need something to hold on to? He looked at her like that was perhaps the most unexpected thing anyone had said to him in months. I'm a grown man, he said. Yes, she said, and it's going to hurt regardless. He looked away. His jaw tightened, and without saying another word, he reached out with his good hand and gripped the edge of the cot frame, and Eleanor cleaned the wound. He did not make a sound. She did not comment on that. When it was done, she redressed it properly and washed her hands in the basin and went back to the stove and brought him the food she had heated. Thin broth, not much, but warm and real. She set it beside the cot. He looked at it. You should eat, she said. You don't have to. Eat, Mr. Whitmore. He ate. She cleaned the kitchen while he slept, which he did within 20 minutes of finishing the broth. He was not a man who fell asleep easily in front of strangers. She could tell by the way he had fought to keep his eyes open, by the way his pride and his exhaustion had gone to war in his face, but the fever and the emptiness had won, and she was glad of it. She worked quietly. She cleared the dishes and scrubbed the table and swept the floor and went through the food stores to understand exactly what she had to work with. She checked the stove's fuel supply and the water situation and made a mental list of the most urgent repairs. The well, first, then the fence nearest to the main house, then the barn door before the next storm. She did not think about the platform. She did not think about the 14 letters. She thought about the work. The work was clear. The work had a logic to it that human feelings did not, and Eleanor had learned early and thoroughly that when everything else was chaos, the work would hold you if you let it. Caleb woke in the late afternoon while she was mending a curtain by the window. You're still here, he said. Yes, she said. I thought I dreamed you. He sat up slowly, wincing. The color in his face was a little better. The broth and the sleep had done something small but real. I'm afraid not, Eleanor said. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not quite read. Not the cold assessment of the platform. Something more complicated than that. Why, he said finally. She looked up from the curtain. Why what? Why are you doing this? She considered the question for a moment before answering. Because I need work, she said, and because you needed someone to stop you from dying. That's not tried again. I rejected you. In front of the whole town. Yes, she said, you did. And you came here anyway. I came here because the ranch needed work done, she said calmly. And because I know what it feels like to have people look at you and decide you're not worth their time. I didn't come here to punish you for it or forgive you for it. I came here because the work needed doing, and I'm the one who was there to do it. He stared at her. That doesn't make any sense, he said. It makes perfect sense, Eleanor said, if you stop trying to understand it in terms of what you deserve. He had nothing to say to that. She went back to her mending. Outside, the sun was dropping toward the mountains, and the long shadows of evening were beginning to move across the floor of the broken ranch, and somewhere in the scrub a bird was singing its end-of-day song. And in the silence between them, the man who had turned his horse away and the woman who had walked 5 miles into his ruin anyway, something was beginning. Neither of them named it. They were both, in their different ways, too careful for that. But it was beginning, and it would not stop. Eleanor stayed. That was the thing the town could not understand when word reached them, as word always did in Willow Creek, that Eleanor Whitaker had taken herself out to Whitmore Ranch and was apparently caring for Caleb and doing work on the property. She must be desperate, said the women at the laundry. Poor creature has nowhere else to go, said Holt at the general store. He'll send her away when he gets back on his feet, said the men at the saloon. Man like Caleb Whitmore isn't going to let a woman like that stay on his land. A woman like that. Eleanor heard about the talk. Margaret told her, not to wound her, but because she thought Eleanor should know what she was walking through. Does it bother you? Margaret asked. Not the way it used to, Eleanor said. And that was mostly true. She was too busy to give the talk more than the minimum of her attention because the ranch was demanding every hour she had. In the first week she addressed the well, the most critical repair, working the pump mechanism until she understood what was wrong with it, and then fixing what she could fix and flagging for Caleb, once he was better, what would need a blacksmith. She cleaned the outbuildings. She addressed the kitchen garden. It was late in the season but not too late for everything, and planted what she could from the supplies she found stored in the barn. She continued to change Caleb's bandages twice daily. She continued to cook. She continued to sleep in the barn, in the small room at the back that had probably been a tack room once, on a bedroll she had brought from Margaret's. She had told Margaret she would be back for her trunk when she had a clearer sense of the situation, and Margaret had said nothing to that except that the room would be held. Caleb was improving. The fever broke on the 5th day, really broke, properly, not just the false break of a fever that retreats and comes back, and Eleanor found him sitting up on his own when she came in with his breakfast, looking out the window at his yard with an expression she could not quite categorize. Not relief, something older and more complicated than relief. How long has it been like this? She asked, setting down the tray. He knew what she meant. 6 months, he said, give or take. You were managing alone. I was managing alone, he confirmed in a tone that made it clear he understood the distinction between managing and actually being all right. I'm going to need your help today, she said, if you're up for it. The fence on the east side is down in 3 places, and I can't lift those posts without someone holding the other end. He looked at her. You're asking me to work, he said. I'm telling you what needs doing, she said. What you choose to do with that is your business. He got up. He was unsteady at first. 6 months of intermittent fever and poor eating had taken more from him than even a stubborn man could fully hide. But he steadied himself, and he followed her out to the east fence line, and he held the posts while she drove. Them and she held the wire while he stretched it, and they worked together in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The town's gossip, had it been able to watch them, would have had nothing new to say. A man and a woman fixing a fence, that was all. But there was something in the working together. Eleanor thought something in the experience of 2 people putting their hands to the same task, and each one making the other's effort count for more than it would have alone. That had a kind of language of its own. Not romance, not friendship exactly, something more fundamental. The recognition that the other person was useful, that the other person was real. Caleb Whitmore had spent 6 months being invisible to himself. He had lost his wife, and then his health, and then his hands, and then his cattle, and then piece by piece, his sense that he was a person worth anyone's time or concern. He had stopped looking in the mirror. He had stopped making plans. He had begun very quietly and very privately to believe that dying alone in his father's house was not the worst possible ending for a man who had run out of reasons to keep going. Eleanor Whitaker had walked 5 miles into the middle of that and refused to agree with his assessment of himself. She did not say it in words, she said it in work. She said it every time she set his breakfast down and expected him to eat it. Every time she handed him a tool and expected him to use it. Every time she asked his opinion on a fence repair or a garden plot or the best way to fix the barn door hinge, asked it like his answer mattered, like he was a person whose knowledge had value. Like he was still the man who had built things and knew his own land. He did not know what to do with it at first. He was suspicious of it the way injured animals are suspicious of offered hands. "Why do you keep asking me things?" he said. One afternoon 3 weeks in, when they were working on the barn door together. "Because you know more about this ranch than I do," she said, as though the answer were obvious. "Why would I not ask you? I thought you came here to help me," he said. "Not to treat you like a man who can do things?" She glanced at him over the barn door. "Is that what you were going to say?" He looked away. He stopped. "I haven't felt like that in a while," he said finally. "Like a man who can do things." Eleanor set down her tool and looked at him directly. Not with pity. She had never done pity. With something more honest than pity. "You're still standing on your own land," she said. "That counts for something, Mr. Whitmore. Call me Caleb," he said. It was almost abrupt, like the words came out before he approved them. He looked briefly startled by them himself. Eleanor studied him for a moment. "Caleb," she said, and that was all. But something settled between them in that afternoon, in the shadow of the old barn, the hinge finally fixed and the door hanging straight for the first time in months. Something quiet and solid that neither of them tried to name or define or rush. In the evenings, when the work was done and the light was failing, they began to sit on the porch. Not close together, not deliberately. But both of them there, in the cooling air, watching the sky change over the mountains, and sometimes talking and sometimes not, and the not talking was comfortable in a way that Eleanor had not experienced in a very long time. He told her about his father one evening. How the old man had built the ranch post by post, fence by fence, a man who believed that land was the only thing that didn't lie to you. How Caleb had grown up learning the land and loving it in the quiet, inarticulate way that some people love things they cannot say out loud. Eleanor listened. She told him in return about Chicago. About the tenement building and her mother, and the way she had grown up understanding that there was a kind of life where you did not have much, but you made it matter. About the matrimonial agency and the letters and what it had felt like to read the word character in a stranger's handwriting and believe it. She said that last part without looking at him. He was quiet for a long time after she said it. "I'm sorry," he said finally. She looked at him. In 6 weeks it was the first time he had said it. "I know," she said. "That's not enough," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it's a beginning." The stars were coming out over Willow Creek. Down the valley, the lights of the town were beginning to appear, those small, warm, domestic lights that meant people were going in to supper, that meant families were gathering at tables. That meant the ordinary human business of evening was beginning. Eleanor looked at those lights, and then up at the stars, and then back at the ranch, the fences that stood straighter than they had 3 weeks ago, the garden that was showing green at the edges. The barn with its door hanging properly on its mended hinge. She had built things here, not what she had imagined building when she bought her train ticket. But things that were real. "You should probably know," Caleb said suddenly, in the tone of a man who has been waiting to say something and decided he has waited long enough, "that the county assessor is coming next week." Eleanor turned to look at him. His jaw was tight. "The taxes," he said. There's more owing than I can manage. He's going to be discussing an auction timeline." How much time? She asked. Maybe 30 days, he said. If I'm lucky. Eleanor looked back at the ranch, at the fences, at the garden, at the barn. 30 days, all right, she said. Eleanor. He said her name for the first time, and it sounded strange and right at the same time in his low voice in the evening air. You don't have to stay for this part. What's coming? You could go back to Margaret's, find proper work in town. I've heard, she said, that there's laundry work in town. The kind where you wash until your hands crack. He looked at her. That's hard labor for poor pay, I know, she said. Eleanor. I'm going to take the laundry work, she said. And every cent I make is going toward that tax debt. And you are going to get back on that horse. The horse you can actually manage, not the one that threw you, and you are going to find those cattle that scattered, because some of them can be found, and you know this land, and you know where they go. He stared at her. You can't. I can, she said. Whether I should is a separate question and one I've already answered for myself. Silence. The mountain night was cold and clean and full of stars. Why? He asked again, the same question he had asked weeks ago and gotten an honest but incomplete answer to. Eleanor looked at him in the starlight. She thought about what to say. She thought about the platform and the horse turning and the town's laughter and the long walk on the dusty road and the smell of a sick man's house and two people fixing a fence in a silence that was not uncomfortable. She thought about what her mother had told her and what she had learned for herself since, and the difference between those two things. Because giving up, she said finally, is something I've watched other people do my whole life, and I have never once seen it end well. She stood up from the porch step. Get some sleep, Caleb, she said. We have a lot of work to do. She walked into the house to check on the stove, and he sat in the dark for a long moment listening to the ordinary sounds of someone moving through his house with purpose and care, and something happened inside him that he had no name for. Something that felt distantly and impossibly like the first edge of beginning to be all right. The morning after Eleanor's first night at Whitmore Ranch, she woke before dawn with the particular alertness of someone whose body had not yet decided whether this new place was safe enough for real sleep. She lay still for a moment in the small back room listening. The ranch had its own sounds, different from the boarding house, different from Chicago, different from anything she had known. The cattle in the near field, the barn settling in the pre-dawn cold. The wind moving through the grass with a sound that was almost like breathing. Then underneath all of it, she heard something else. A cough, hard and deep, the kind of cough that comes from a chest that has been fighting something for too long without adequate rest or food or anyone paying attention to whether it was winning. She got up. Caleb was sitting on the edge of his cot when she came through the door, bent forward with both elbows on his knees and the cough working through him in waves. He looked up when she came in, and the expression on his face was the one she had already learned to recognize as his default reaction to being seen in a moment of weakness, a flash of something between anger and shame, quickly controlled, quickly replaced with a neutrality that was doing a great deal of work. Go back to sleep, he said when the cough released him. I was awake, she said. She went to the stove. Has that been happening through the night? It's nothing. Has it been happening through the night? A pause. Some, he said. She built the fire without commenting on the admission because she had learned already in the span of one day, which was how quickly you learned certain things about certain people, that Caleb Whitmore responded better to action than to concern. Concern made him defensive. Action he could work alongside. You need steam, she said, and willow bark tea if there's any in this house. There's no willow bark. There's something in your stores that will do, she said. I'll find it. She did find a dried yarrow, which wasn't ideal but would help, and she boiled water and made him drink the tea while she changed his arm bandaging in the firelight. And he submitted to both with the slightly stunned compliance of a man who had been managing alone for so long that being managed had become foreign. You're going to be here when it's light? He said, when she was done. The question was careful, not hoping exactly, or not allowing itself to hope. Yes, she said. He lay back down. She went back to the small room and sat on her bedroll and listened to the ranch settle back into its pre-dawn quiet, and she allowed herself to think, clearly and without sentiment, about what she was doing. She was staying. She had made the decision somewhere in the night without marking the moment it became a decision rather than a temporary arrangement. The ranch needed her. The man needed her. Those were the practical facts. But underneath the practical facts was something else. A recognition that she had come 900 miles to build something real, and real things were not always built in the place or the shape you originally intended. She had arrived expecting a husband. What she had found was harder and more honest than a husband. She had found a man who needed saving, a ranch that needed saving, and the unexpected discovery that she was someone who could do the saving. She went back to sleep. When she woke again, it was full light and she could hear Caleb moving in the main room slowly, carefully. With the deliberate pace of a man managing pain that he had decided not to mention, and she got up and went to make breakfast and found him standing at the kitchen window looking out at his yard with an expression she could not read from behind. "The water trough on the east side is cracked," she said. He turned. He had not heard her come in. "I know," he said. "The cattle can't get to the well pump themselves," she said. "How have you been managing it?" "I haven't," he said. And the admission cost him. She could see exactly what it cost him in the line of his jaw and the way he looked away. "All right," she said. "I'll manage it today. You need to rest that arm." "Eleanor, Caleb." She set the pan on the stove and looked at him directly. "I am not offering you sympathy. I am making a practical observation. You cannot carry water with one good arm without aggravating the infected one. I can carry water with two arms. This is arithmetic, not charity." He looked at her for a long moment. He did not say thank you. He said the buckets are in the north barn, which was, she was learning, how he said thank you. She found the buckets. The first week established a rhythm that neither of them designed, and both of them fell into the way people fall into things that fit, without announcement, without ceremony. Simply by doing the next necessary thing and finding the other person already doing the complementary thing. Eleanor managed the water and the cooking and the medical care. She cleaned the house with the systematic efficiency of someone who understood that a clean space was not aesthetic but functional. It reduced the variables that could hurt a sick person. It made supplies findable. It made the difference between a house that was recovering and a house that was still dying. Caleb managed what he could manage with one arm and a fever that was improving slowly but had not broken fully. He told her things she needed to know about the ranch without being asked, which she recognized as his version of cooperation. Which fence was the most critical? Where the well pump's weak point? Which of the neighboring ranches shared a fence line? And which of their hands might be approached about temporary help, if it came to that? He knew things. She had expected a broken man. She had not expected a broken man who still had all of his knowledge intact, all of his understanding of this land and this work, preserved perfectly inside the physical collapse of fever and neglect, and the worst collapse of having stopped believing it mattered. On the third day she asked him about the cattle. He went still. "They scattered in the storm," he said, 8 months ago. "I gathered what I could before the arm went bad. The rest he stopped." "How many?" she said. "I had 40 head," he said. "I have 11 confirmed, and the rest? Some are dead," he said. "Some are in the scrubland. Some might have drifted to neighboring properties." He looked at the window. I haven't been able to ride out to look." She understood the pause. He hadn't had the physical capacity to look, and he hadn't had the belief that looking would change anything. And those two things had fed each other, in the way that helplessness and hopelessness always fed each other until you couldn't tell which came first. "When your arm is better," she said, "we'll look." He turned to look at her. "Eleanor," he said, "even if we find them. Even if we get the cattle back, the tax situation." "One thing at a time," she said. "The arm first, then the cattle." "Then the taxes, you Caleb." She looked at him steadily. "Have I asked you for permission to solve any of this?" A pause. "No," he said. "Then stop waiting for me to start," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but had the shape of one somewhere inside it, and looked away, and she could see something shift in him. Something small and significant, the way a single stone shifts and changes the direction of water. She went back to work. On the fourth day, a man appeared at the ranch gate. She was in the yard working on the well pump when she saw him, a man on horseback, perhaps 40, with the look of someone who had stopped on purpose and was deciding whether to proceed. She straightened and looked at him directly. "Can I help you?" she said. "I'm looking for Whitmore," he said. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized, the particular male assessment of a woman who was somewhere she apparently wasn't expected to be. "He's resting," she said. "What's your business?" "My business is with Whitmore," the man said. "And I'm asking you to state it to me first," Eleanor said without raising her voice. "Since I'm the one standing at the gate." The man looked at her for another moment. "Greer," he said finally, "I run the property east of here. We share a fence line on the far side of the south pasture." He paused. "I heard Whitmore was in a bad way. He's recovering," she said. "And you're Eleanor Whitmore," she said. It was the first time she had used the name. She had not planned it. It came out with the certainty of something that had been decided without her conscious participation, and once it was in the air, she did not walk it back. Greer looked at her. "I heard he sent for a bride," he said. He was recalibrating. She could see it revising the story he had brought with him. "He did," she said. "And you're staying on," he said. He spiked. "Despite what, Mr. Greer?" He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "I came to offer a hand with the south fence," he said after a moment. "Two of my men have a half-day spare on Thursday, if Whitmore wants the help." Eleanor looked at him. "We'd be glad of it," she said. "Thank you." He tipped his hat, a genuine tip, not a perfunctory one, and turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. Eleanor stood at the gate for a moment after he left. Eleanor Whitmore. She tested the weight of it privately. It was not a fantasy, she was clear-eyed enough about where she and Caleb actually stood to know that, but it was a declaration of intent. A statement to the world about where she had decided to be. She went inside and told Caleb that Greer was sending men Thursday. Caleb stared at her. "Greer," he said. "Greer is sending help." "Two men," she said. "Half a day the south fence." "Greer hasn't." He stopped. "We haven't spoken since. It's been a long time since Greer offered anything to this property." "He offered today," she said. "I accepted." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" he said. "That we'd be glad of the help," she said. "And that you were recovering." "And about that I was here," she said. "And staying." He looked at her with the expression she still couldn't entirely read, the complicated one, the layered one, the ones that seemed to be happening on several levels simultaneously. "All right," he said. "All right," she confirmed and went back to the pump. Thursday, Greer's men came and worked the south fence, and Eleanor fed them at midday because feeding people who were working your land was the basic courtesy of the territory. And the men ate without much talking, and worked efficiently, and left the fence in materially better condition than it had been. Nothing was said about the circumstances of Eleanor's presence at the ranch. Nothing needed to be said, but Caleb watched from the window of the main house. He was still not up to sustained outdoor work, and when Eleanor came inside that afternoon, she found him at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil. "What are you doing?" she said. "Making a list," he said. She leaned over and looked. It was a list of the ranch's most critical needs, ranked by urgency, with rough cost estimates beside each one, and notes about what could be done without hired labor versus what required it. It was precise and knowledgeable, and represented a mind that was finally turning back toward the problem of the future instead of sitting inside the problem of the present. Eleanor looked at the list. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "The well housing," she said, pointing. "You've underestimated that." "By how much?" "Double it," she said. "The wood is more compromised than it looks from the outside." "I checked yesterday." He revised the number. "The cattle," she said. "Before we do anything else on this list, we need to know what we actually have to work with. The rest of this depends on the cattle." "I know," he said. He looked at her. "My arm is better." "It's better," she agreed. "It's not healed. It's better enough to ride," he said. "If I'm careful." She looked at him. She looked at the list. She looked at the window. 3 more days, she said. Eleanor Day, she said. And then you ride. And I ride with you. He looked at her. You can ride, he said. I can learn, she said. He made the not quite law sound again. 3 days, he agreed. In those 3 days, Eleanor did several things she did not tell Caleb about because she did not want to have the argument about whether she had the right to do them. She walked into town. She went to the general store, and she had a long, careful conversation with Holt that was ostensibly about supply prices, but was actually about the state of Caleb Whitmore's reputation in Willow Creek and what it would take to begin repairing it. Holt was a blunt man, and he was blunt with her, which she appreciated. People gave up on that ranch, Holt said. When a man gives up on his own property, the town takes its cue. The man hasn't given up, Eleanor said. He's been sick. Some say the same thing, Holt said. And what do you say? Holt looked at her for a moment. I say a man whose hired hand's wife just told me his fence is being repaired and his water is running, and there's smoke coming from his chimney. Most mornings doesn't sound like a man who has given up, he said. Eleanor held his gaze. Spread that around, she said. If you'd be willing. Holt looked at her for a long moment. You're not what I was told to expect, he said. No, she said. I reckon I'm not. She bought what she needed from his store and walked back to the ranch. She also, on the second of those 3 days, sat down and wrote a letter. It was to the matrimonial agency in Chicago, not with a complaint, not with an account of what had happened, but with a careful, specific inquiry about whether there was a mechanism by which the financial deposit she had paid for their services might be partially returned, given the irregular circumstances of the arrangement. She wrote it in the precise, accounting language she had always been best at. She presented the facts without drama, and she asked for a specific amount. She did not tell Caleb about the letter. She did not tell him about it because the amount she was asking for was small and might not come, and she did not want him to feel that she was scraping for funds on his behalf, which she was, but not in a way that required him to know it until the money arrived. The money did arrive eventually 6 weeks later. But that was later. On the 3rd day, Caleb's fever broke. Not the partial break she had managed twice before, where the temperature dropped and then climbed again. This was the real break, the one that left him wrung out and hollow, but genuinely cooler. Genuinely clearer, genuinely on the other side of the worst of it. She knew it when she came in that morning and found him standing at the window, rather than lying on the cot. Standing, upright, without holding on to anything. Good morning, she said carefully. He turned, his eyes were clear. I'm hungry, he said. She made breakfast. He ate 2 full plates of it and drank 3 cups of coffee and sat at the kitchen table afterward, looking around the room with the expression of a man who has returned to a place after a long absence and is cataloging what has changed. A great deal had changed. The kitchen was clean, the floor was scrubbed. The window above the basin was unfogged, the grime cleared from the glass. The shelves were organized with the precision of someone who understood that knowing where things were was the difference between managing and being managed by your circumstances. On the table, the ledger books were stacked neatly beside the piece of paper he had been working on 3 days ago, and on top of that paper was Eleanor's own additions, further calculations, cross-referenced with the supply costs she had gotten from Holt. Caleb looked at the ledger. He looked at the calculations. He looked at the kitchen. He looked at Eleanor. How long was I actually down, he said. He meant not from the fall, but from the moment he had stopped fighting the ranch's collapse and started just waiting inside it. That's not mine to say, she said. He looked at the room again. A while, he said, answering his own question. Yes, she said. He was quiet. Eleanor, he said. I'm sorry, he said. For the platform, I said it before. But I want to say it now that I can mean it properly. She looked at him across the kitchen. I know, she said. Eat your breakfast, he ate. They rode out to look her for the cattle on the 4th day. Eleanor had, in the 3 days she promised to wait, spent 2 of them learning to stay on a horse. Caleb's second horse, a smaller, older mare named Bessie, who had apparently decided long ago that human anxiety was not worth her concern, submitted to Eleanor's inexperience with philosophical calm. And by the end of the second day, Eleanor was not riding well, but she was riding. On the fourth day, Caleb watched her mount Bessie with the careful assessment of a man who was choosing between saying something and not saying something. He didn't say anything. She appreciated that. They rode the back acres of the ranch, and then further into the scrubland that bordered Whitmore land to the north and west. Caleb rode in the controlled, slightly careful way of a man managing a healing arm, and Eleanor rode in the controlled, slightly careful way of someone who had been on a horse for 2 days total. And together, they covered ground that neither could have covered alone. Caleb found the first cattle an hour out 4 head in a dry creek bed, thin but alive. He moved them back toward the ranch, with the efficiency of a man who had been doing this work his whole life. And Eleanor watched and learned, and kept Bessie out of the way and paid attention to how it was done. 4, he said, when the cattle were moving in the right direction. 6 more than we had yesterday, she said. He glanced at her. You always do that, he said. Do what? Count what's gained, he said. Most people count what's missing. She considered this. Counting what's missing doesn't move the cattle, she said. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said, it doesn't. They found 3 more that afternoon, further out. And by the time they turned back toward the ranch, the light was failing, and Eleanor's body was making its opinions about 2 days of riding experience, followed by a full day in the saddle, very clear to her. She did not mention it. Caleb, who had been watching her with the sideways attention she had come to recognize as his primary mode of paying attention to things he didn't want to appear to be paying attention to, pulled his horse alongside hers as they neared the ranch gate. You're going to be sore tomorrow, he said. Probably, she said. You should have said something. We needed to cover the ground, she said. Eleanor. He said it in the tone she had used on him a dozen times, not hard, not soft, direct in the way that serious things required. You are allowed to have limits. She looked at him. It was the first time he had said something like that to her. The first time he had turned the care around in her direction, with the same directness she had aimed at him. She did not know entirely what to do with it. I know, she said. Do you? He said. She looked at the ranch gate ahead of them, the gate that was hers now in every sense that mattered, regardless of what any paper said. I'm learning, she said. He nodded once. They rode through the gate. The next 2 weeks were the weeks that built something between them that neither of them named directly, but both of them understood was being built. They rode out every other day to search for the scattered cattle, and they found more. Not all of them. Some were gone for good. But more than Caleb had believed were findable, and in the days between the rides they worked the ranch, and the rhythm of the work became the grammar of a new language between them. Eleanor was the one who noticed when Caleb was overdoing it, and said so in terms that were practical rather than solicitous. And Caleb began to be the one who noticed when Eleanor was working past the point of reasonable endurance, and said so in terms that were direct rather than gentle. And neither of them took offense at being noticed, because they had both learned that being noticed, really noticed, by another person was not an intrusion. It was a gift. On a Wednesday in the 3rd week, the gift nearly disappeared. Eleanor had gone to town for supplies, a longer trip than usual, because she was negotiating with Holt about a credit arrangement that would allow her to purchase what the ranch needed against the future cattle sale, and she was later coming back than she had intended. She was within a mile of the ranch gate when she heard the sound. A horse, moving fast, and then Caleb's voice, raised, which she had never heard before, and which stopped her in her tracks on the road. She picked up her pace. She came through the gate to find Caleb standing in the yard, still as stone, and a man on horseback who was apparently departing, moving his horse away from the yard at the kind of speed that said the conversation had not ended pleasantly. Caleb's jaw was set. His good hand was at his side, and the fingers of it were slightly curled, which she had also not seen before. Caleb, she said. He turned. Who was that? She said. He looked at her for a moment. Ames, he said. He runs a property 2 valleys over. What did he want? Caleb was quiet for a moment that was longer than it needed to be. He made an offer, he said, on the ranch. Eleanor went still. What kind of offer? Below market, Caleb said. Significantly, he looked at where the rider had gone. He said he was doing me a favor. Said everyone in the county knows the ranch is going to auction, and I might as well take something now rather than lose it entirely at auction for whatever Bannerman decides to pay. Eleanor put her bag down. "What did you tell him?" she said. "I told him to get off my land," Caleb said. She looked at him. His jaw was still set, and his hand was still curled, and there was something in his eyes that was not quite the darkness she had first seen there. It was something different, something that had more energy in it, more forward momentum. Anger, the functional kind, the kind that came from caring about something enough to fight for it. "Good," she said. He looked at her. "Eleanor," he said. "He wasn't wrong about the auction. If Bannerman decides he wants this land." "Bannerman hasn't decided anything yet," she said. "And we have time, and we have more cattle than we had 2 weeks ago." "It's not enough. It's more than we had," she said. "That's what we're working with." He looked at her for a long moment with the complicated expression. "Why does this matter to you?" he said. "This is my debt. My land, my failure. You could walk away from all of it." "You have every reason to." She looked at him directly. "Because it stopped being only yours somewhere around the 3rd fence post," she said. He stared at her. "When we fixed that east fence together," she said. "When you held the post and I drove it. Something like that, working something together. It doesn't stay only one person's. That's how working together works." He was very quiet. She picked up her bag. "I'm going to start supper," she said. "And tomorrow we're going to ride the far north sections, because I think there are cattle there that haven't been accounted for." "Eleanor," he said. He stopped, started again. "I don't have the right words for what—" "You don't need words," she said. "You need supper and a good night's sleep." She walked into the house. He stood in the yard for a moment, then he followed her in. That night they sat on the porch after supper, and Eleanor told him about the credit arrangement with Holt. And he listened without interrupting, and asked 2 precise questions at the end that told her he had understood exactly what she had done, and why. And she answered them, and the night was quiet around them, with the specific quiet of 2 people who have gotten through a difficult day together, and are sitting in the relief of the other side of it. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When I wrote those letters," he said, "to the agency, I wrote them because I believed what I wrote, but I also wrote them because I was trying to solve a problem. The ranch needed a different future than the one I was capable of building alone." He paused. I want you to know that I wasn't trying to deceive anyone. But I also wasn't—" He stopped again. "I wasn't thinking about the woman who would read those letters as a person. I was thinking about a solution." Eleanor looked at the dark yard. "I know," she said. That wasn't right," he said. "No," she agreed, "it wasn't. And yet you're still here," he said. "I'm still here," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he said. Not the old question, the defensive one. A different version, quieter, more honest. She thought about the real answer. "Because you wrote the word character," she said, "and I believed it. And then I came here, and I found out that the man who wrote it was sick and broken and had given up on himself, and I thought—" She stopped. "I thought, that's not a man who doesn't have character. That's a man who forgot he had it." She looked at him. "I don't walk away from something because it's harder than I expected. I walk toward it." He held her gaze. In the dark on the porch of a ranch that was still more problem than promise, with 30 days of tax debt accumulating somewhere in the county records and a cattle count that was better but not enough. With cracked hands and a healing arm and the whole uncertain weight of what came next pressing down on both of them, he held her gaze. "I'm glad you didn't," he said. "So am I," she said. The stars came out over Willow Creek, and the night settled into its full dark, and on the porch of Whitmore Ranch 2 people who had both been given up on sat in the quiet that had grown between them. Not the empty quiet of 2 strangers. Not the tense quiet of 2 people managing a difficult situation, but the full and breathing quiet of 2 people who had decided, without ceremony and without announcement, that whatever came next, they were going to face it from the same side. The county assessor's name was Gerald Pruitt, and he arrived at Whitmore Ranch on a Tuesday morning riding a gray mare and carrying a leather satchel that Eleanor had learned in her weeks in Willow Creek, meant official trouble of the financial variety. She saw him coming up the track from the kitchen window, and she set down her bread dough and wiped her hands on her apron and walked outside to meet him before he reached the door. Caleb was in the south field. She had sent him there at dawn to check the cattle he had spent the past 2 weeks gathering back from the scrubland. 17 head so far, less than half of what had scattered. But real animals on real ground, which was more than they had 3 weeks ago. She had wanted him out there working, not sitting in the house, waiting for Pruitt's visit, with the particular darkness that waiting had always brought down on him. She had not told Caleb when exactly Pruitt was coming. She had known it was today. She had wanted to hear it first herself. "Ma'am," Pruitt said, tipping his hat as he dismounted. He was a thin man in his 50s with a precise mustache and the expression of someone who had spent enough years delivering bad news that he had stopped feeling bad about it. "Is Mr. Whitmore available?" "He's working," Eleanor said. "You can speak with me." Pruitt looked at her with the mild confusion of a man who had not expected to be addressed by a woman as though she had authority here. "I have business with the property owner, ma'am, and I have the property owner's ear," Eleanor said. "So unless you'd like to ride another 5 miles out to the south field and find him yourself, you can tell me what you came to say, and I'll see that he hears it accurately." Pruitt studied her for a moment. Then he opened his satchel. The numbers were not good. Eleanor had known they would not be good. She had spent enough evenings going through Caleb's account books with him. The two of them sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp between them and the ledgers open, to understand the shape of the debt clearly. But seeing it written in Pruitt's official hand, stamped with the county seal, made it real in a way that the ledgers had not. Whitmore Ranch owed $462 in back taxes. The auction would be scheduled for 30 days from the date of the notice. Unless the full amount was paid by that date, the property would be sold to the highest bidder. Pruitt handed her the notice, and she read it twice, and then folded it carefully along its existing crease and held it in both hands. "Is there any room for negotiation on the timeline?" she asked. "I'm afraid not, ma'am. The county's been generous with the extensions already." "This one's firm. I see." She looked at him. "Thank you for delivering it in person." He seemed faintly surprised by being thanked. "Yes, ma'am." He put his hat back on and remounted his gray mare and rode back up the track without looking back, and Eleanor stood in the yard, holding the folded notice and working through the arithmetic she already knew the outcome of. 30 days, $462. 2 people, one of whom was still not fully recovered, one of whom had a laundry job that paid 8 cents per load. She stood there long enough to work through all of the arithmetic, including the parts she had already tried and the parts she had been trying not to think about. Then she put the notice in her apron pocket and went back inside and finished her bread and waited for Caleb to come in for the midday meal. She told him over dinner. She put the notice on the table beside his plate and watched his face as he read it, and she did not look away when the color left his jaw and the familiar darkness moved into his eyes. "Eleanor," he said. "We have 30 days, she said. "I know what it says." He set the notice down. He pushed back slightly from the table. "I know what it says, and I know what it means. You should go back to Margaret's. Today, get proper work in town, somewhere with a real wage." "I already have work in town," she said. "I start at the laundry tomorrow morning." "That's not. You can't wash enough clothes in 30 days to make $400. "No," she said, not alone. She looked at him steadily. "You have 17 cattle. I have 17 cattle, no buyer lined up, and no. Holt at the general store has a buyer in Denver," she said. "I spoke with him last week. He takes delivery at the rail yard. The price per head is $22 for good stock." Caleb stared at her. "You spoke to Holt," he said. "About my cattle. About cattle in general," she said carefully. "I asked about the market. I didn't mention specific numbers." "Eleanor, 17 head at $22 is $374, she said. "If I work every day at the laundry for the next 4 weeks, and we are careful with everything else, we can cover the remainder." He was quiet for a moment that felt very long. "You worked all this out," he said. I work things out, she said. It's what I do. He picked up the notice again and looked at it and set it back down. Even if we make the number, he said quietly, even if we manage it, Eleanor, this is not your debt. This is not your land. You walked in here to help me and I—
He stopped.
His voice had gone rough. I don't have any right to let you work yourself to the bone for something that isn't yours. That's not your decision, she said. It is my decision. It's my land. It's my Caleb. She said his name in the tone that had developed between them over the past weeks. Not hard, not soft, but direct in the way that serious things required directness. I make my own choices. You don't have the right to take that from me just because you feel guilty. He looked at her. His jaw worked for a moment. Why are you doing this? He asked. And this time the question carried more weight than it had the other 2 times he had asked it, because this time they both understood what the answer would cost. Eleanor looked at him across the kitchen table in the midday light, in the house she had cleaned and the room she had cooked in for 6 weeks, and she thought about the honest answer. She had several honest answers, and she chose the most honest one. Because somewhere in the last 6 weeks, she said, this stopped being about me having nowhere else to go. Silence. The bread she had baked was cooling on the counter. Outside, one of the recovered cattle lowed from the south field. The clock on the wall, the one she had cleaned and restarted in the first week, ticked steadily through the afternoon air. Caleb looked down at the table. I don't deserve that, he said. I'm not doing it because you deserve it, she said. I'm doing it because it's right. She stood and began clearing the plates. Now you need to contact Holt about the Denver buyer today. And you need to get those other cattle found before we run out of time. He sat at the table for another moment, and she could feel him working through something, some internal argument. Some calculation of a different kind than the one she had just done with the money, and then he stood and picked up his hat from the hook by the door. I'll ride out to Holt's this afternoon, he said. Good, she said. He paused at the door. Eleanor. Yes? He looked at her from the doorway, his hat in his hand, in the way that men from that time and place sometimes looked at things they did not know how to say. Thank you, he said. She turned back to the dishes. Go find Holt. She heard the door close behind him, and she stood at the wash basin for a moment, with her hands in the water, and let herself feel, for just a few seconds, the full weight of what she had just committed to. Then she pushed the weight down to somewhere manageable and began planning the next 30 days. She started at the laundry the following morning, before the sun fully cleared the mountains. Mrs. Dunn ran the establishment, a wide, capable woman who had built the business herself and who had no patience for slowness or self-pity in either herself or anyone who worked for her. She looked Eleanor over when Eleanor arrived and told her the rate was 8 cents per load, and that loads were counted by what Eleanor could accomplish in a day, and that complaints were not welcome. I don't have any complaints, Eleanor said. We'll see, said Mrs. Dunn. They saw quickly. Eleanor worked. She had always been physically strong in the way that women who had never had the luxury of not being physically strong tend to be efficiently, without drama, for as long as the work required. She lifted and scrubbed and wrung and hung and lifted again, and by the end of the first day Mrs. Dunn told her she could come back tomorrow, which in Mrs. Dunn's vocabulary was high praise. Eleanor came back. Every morning she walked into town before first light and worked until mid-afternoon, and then she walked back out to the ranch and worked until dark. Her hands cracked in the first week. She bound them at night with cloth strips soaked in the small amount of tallow she allowed herself, and by morning they were functional again, if not comfortable, and she went back to work. Caleb watched. He did not say much about it. He was not a man given to abundant speech, and she had learned that about him and found it suited her own nature, but she caught him watching sometimes. When she came in from the walk, when she was binding her hands in the evening, when she sat at the table going over the ledger with the day's numbers. And he worked. He rode out every day, pushing further into the scrubland and the canyon country that bordered the ranch's back acres, looking for the scattered cattle. He came home some evenings with 2 head, some evenings with none, one evening with 6 that he had found together in a narrow valley 2 hours out. They talked in the evenings. It had become the rhythm of them work, the long day, the coming in, the supper, the talk. The talk was not always serious. Some evenings they argued about the most efficient way to repair the south barn's roof, and Eleanor was right, and Caleb was right about a different part of it. And the argument ended in what she could only describe as a compromise that was better than either of their original positions. Some evenings Caleb told stories about the territory, about the early days of the ranch, about his father's friends, about the particular world of frontier ranching that was already, in 1884, beginning to change into something different from what it had been. Some evenings, Eleanor talked about Chicago and about her mother, and Caleb listened with the attentiveness of a man who understood that listening was its own form of work. One evening in the third week, he asked her about the letters. It came out of nowhere, the way the questions that matter tend to come out sideways, in a gap between other things, in the moment when defenses were down. "The letters I wrote," he said. "Did you keep them?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Yes, I wrote what I believed," he said. "When I wrote them, I want you to know that I wasn't trying to deceive anyone." "I believed it, I know," she said, "but then I saw—" He stopped. Started again. "When the train stopped and I saw you on the platform, He stopped again." Eleanor waited. "I didn't see what I believed I'd see," he said finally. "And I reacted to what I saw instead of what I believed. And I have thought about that every day since you walked through my door, and I don't have a justification for it. I have an explanation, but it's not a justification." "What's the explanation?" she asked, quietly, without anger. She genuinely wanted to know. He looked at his hands. "Clara," he said. "When Clara left, she said things before she went. About the ranch and about me, about what she'd thought she was getting and what she actually got. And I think somewhere in the months after that, He paused. "I wrote those letters because I believed what I wrote. But when the train stopped, I looked at you and I thought, she came here for something she's going to be disappointed in, too. And the look on her face when she finds out what she actually got." He stopped. "So you left," Eleanor said, before I could. The silence was long enough that she could hear the fire settle in the stove. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "I didn't leave," she said. "No," he said, "you didn't. I'm not Clara," she said, and it was not an accusation, it was simply a fact that needed to be stated clearly, and she stated it clearly. "I know," he said. "God, Eleanor, I know that all right," she said. She went back to the ledger. But something had shifted between them, another thing named, another weight distributed more evenly between two people, and the room felt different after it, in the way rooms sometimes do when an honest conversation has moved through them. That was the same night she walked back from the outhouse, to find Caleb sitting on the porch in the dark, and she almost walked past him and then stopped. "Can't sleep," she said, thinking he said. She sat on the step below him as she sometimes did. "We're going to make it," she said. "The numbers are going to work." "That's not what I'm thinking about," he said. She looked at the stars. "What are you thinking about?" "What happens after?" he said. "If we make the number and keep the ranch, what happens to you?" She had thought about this herself, privately, in the small hours of the mornings when practical thinking took over from sleep. "I'll find proper work," she said, "in town probably. Mrs. Dunn has indicated she'd keep me on at the laundry. If..." "That's not what I mean," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her in the dark with an expression she could not fully read but recognized in its shape, the expression of a man about to say something that he has been not saying for long enough that it has started to cost him. "Caleb," she said carefully. "I know I don't have the right," he said. "After everything. I know what I did and I know it's not. I know I don't have the right to ask you anything." "Ask me what?" she said. He looked back. "To stay," he said. "Not because of the work, not because of the debt or the ranch or because you've got nowhere else." He was choosing his words with the care of a man who did not have many of them and knew it. "Because I'd like you to." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the platform. She thought about the horse turning. She thought about walking 5 miles on a dusty road into a ruin because she had nowhere else to go, and because underneath that practical truth, She had recognized something in the story of a man everyone had given up on. She thought about the fence line they had fixed together, and the barn door, and the evenings on the porch, and the kitchen table with the ledger between them, and the way he said her name now Eleanor like it meant something specific and real to him. "Ask me again," she said, "when the 30 days are done and the debt is paid." He looked at her. "Why?" he said. "Because I want you to ask me when it costs you nothing to let me go," she said. "When the ranch is safe and you don't need me for anything practical." "I want to know if you'll still ask me then." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll still ask," he said. "Then ask me then," she said. She went inside. He sat on the porch for a long time after. The next morning brought something none of their planning had accounted for. Eleanor was coming back from the laundry in the early afternoon when she heard voices ahead of her on the road, several voices, men's voices. With the particular easy cruelty of men who were saying things they thought were harmless, because they thought no one who mattered was listening. She rounded the bend in the road and found 3 men on horseback. She recognized 2 of them, ranch hands from a neighboring property, and they had stopped on the road and were talking. And the subject of their conversation became clear to her within 3 steps. "Heard she's living out there on his property," one of them was saying, the larger of the 2 she recognized, a man named Greer who she had seen at the general store. "Just settled herself right in, no shame about it." "Well, where else is she going to go?" said the other man she recognized. "Who else is going to take her?" The third man said something she didn't catch, and all 3 of them laughed. Eleanor kept walking. She kept her eyes forward and her pace steady, and she walked past the 3 men on horseback without looking at any of them, and for a moment the talking stopped, the abrupt, guilty silence of people who have been heard doing something they knew was unkind. "Ma'am," said Greer, after a pause, in a tone that carried a smirk inside it. Eleanor walked past without answering. She heard the laughter resume behind her, lower now, a little less comfortable than it had been. She walked until she was out of their sight, and then she stopped. She stopped on the road, and she stood still for a moment, and she did what she had learned to do with the particular pain of being spoken about as though she were not real. She found the edges of it, she assessed it, and she decided what it would and would not cost her. It would not cost her the ranch. It would not cost her the 30 days. It would not cost her what was being built, slowly and carefully and without a name, between her and Caleb. She walked on. When she reached the ranch, Caleb was in the yard, and he could read her face, apparently, better than she had known, because he was at the gate before she reached it. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Eleanor." "Greer and some others on the road," she said. "Just talk." His jaw tightened in a way she had learned to recognize. "What did they say?" "Nothing worth repeating," she said. "And nothing I haven't heard before. That doesn't mean—" "Caleb," she looked at him, "I am not going to spend energy I don't have on the opinions of men who don't matter. If you want to do something useful with your anger, go check on the cattle." He looked at her for a moment with an intensity that had not been in his expression before, not protective exactly, or not only protective, but something that sat closer to the bone than protectiveness. "All right," he said finally. "I'm going to start supper," she said, and walked past him into the house. He didn't go check on the cattle immediately. She knew, because she could see through the kitchen window, that he stood in the yard for a moment first, looking down the road in the direction she had come from, with his hands at his sides and his jaw set. She didn't say anything about it, but she also didn't pretend she hadn't seen it. 4 days before the auction, Caleb rode into town to make the arrangement with Holt about the Denver cattle buyer. He came back in the late afternoon with the buyer confirmed and the delivery date set, and also with a look on his face that Eleanor recognized immediately as a man who had heard something in town that he was uncertain whether to share. "Tell me," she said, before he took his coat off. He looked at her. "Pruitt has been talking," he said, "about the auction. People know the exact amount, they know the date. And there are buyers already interested in the land." "Who?" she said. "Bannerman," he said. She had heard that name. James Bannerman was the largest landowner in the county. A man who had been building his holdings systematically for 20 years by purchasing distressed properties at auction when their owners couldn't hold on. He was not cruel in any active sense. He was simply the kind of man who understood that other people's misfortune, properly timed, was opportunity. He wants the south acreage, Caleb said, the valley land. It connects his north pasture to the ridge property he picked up last year. How do you know? Because he told Holt he'd be at the auction, Caleb said. Holt told me. He sat down at the kitchen table. Bannerman can outbid anything we can put together, Eleanor. If he decides he wants this land, he'll have it. She sat across from him. How much do we have, she said. They went through the numbers again. 17 cattle confirmed for the Denver sale, at $22 per head, $374. Eleanor's wages from the laundry over 4 weeks she had worked every day, more loads than any other worker misses. Dunn employed came to $61 and change. They had scraped together another $20 from the sales of some surplus equipment in the barn. $455. They needed $462. $7 short, $7. We could sell the spare saddle, Caleb said. It's worth maybe $4, Eleanor said, if Holt is in a buying mood. That's still $3 short. She looked at the ledger. He looked at her. Eleanor, he said, you know Bannerman. Don't, she said. He's not going to stop at the $7, he said. He's going to walk into that auction, and he's going to bid whatever he needs to bid to get this land. We could have 462 on the table, and it won't matter if he decides to go to 500. He might not, she said. He might. She looked at him. Is this land worth fighting for, she said. Yes. Yes. Then we fight for it, she said. We show up, we put what we have on the table, and if Bannerman takes it, then we know we did everything that could be done. And if he takes it, then we figure out what comes next, she said. But we don't surrender it before he's even in the room. Caleb looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was complicated and layered and said several things at once, and then he said, I need to tell you something. His voice had changed. Eleanor looked at him. There's something I haven't said, he said. That I should have said. That I kept not saying because I wasn't sure how to say it without it sounding like. He stopped. Tried again. When Clara left, she told me that nobody was going to want what I had. This land, this life, me. She said I'd already given the best years of this ranch and all I had left to offer was the debt. And I believed her. I believed her for a long time. Eleanor waited. And then you walked in, he said. And you didn't. You weren't looking at the ranch and calculating what you could get from it. You were looking at it and seeing what it could be. And you weren't looking at me and seeing what I'd lost. You were looking at me and he stopped again. His voice was lower now. I don't know how to explain what it felt like. To be seen like that. By someone who had every reason not to. She said nothing. I'm not good at this, he said. I know, she said. But I don't want you to not know it, he said. Before the auction. Whatever happens. I don't want you to not know that what you did here, what you are. It changed something in me that I didn't think could be changed anymore. The clock on the wall ticked through the silence. Eleanor looked at the man across the table from her. The man who had turned his horse away on a train platform and who had said get out in a voice scraped raw with fever, and who had held the fence post steady while she drove it and who sat on the porch in the dark asking questions he didn't know how to ask. I know, she said again. Is that all you're going to say? He said, and there was a trace of something in it. Not humor exactly, but the edge of it, the place where sorrow and humor existed in proximity to each other. Ask me the question, she said, after the auction. He held her gaze. After the auction, he said. The morning of the auction, Eleanor woke before dawn. She lay in the small back room she had made into her sleeping space and she listened to the ranch, the sounds of it, the particular sounds that a property makes when it is alive, when it is tended, when someone has been paying attention to it. The creak of the barn, the low voices of the cattle in the near field. The wind through the grass. She had walked into this place 6 weeks ago, with a wooden trunk and a plan that extended no further than the next 5 minutes, and somewhere in the 6 weeks it had become She did not have the right word for it. Home was too simple, too early maybe, but something. She got up. She put on her better dress, the one she had saved for Sundays and for occasions that required more than the working dress, and she did her hair with more care than she usually took. And she stood at the small mirror in the washroom and looked at herself. The woman in the mirror had cracked hands bound in cloth. She had the face she had always had, the round, soft face that had spent 29 years being judged before it was known. She had the body that had carried her 900 miles and 6 weeks of hard labor and every difficult thing she had ever been asked to carry. She looked herself in the eye. "You're still standing," she said to the mirror. She walked out to make breakfast. Caleb was already up. He was standing at the kitchen window when she came in, looking out at the ranch with an expression that was not quite peace and not quite resignation, but something in between the look of a man who has decided to accept whatever comes with as much dignity as he can manage. "Breakfast," she said. He turned. He looked at her, took in the better dress, the careful hair, and something moved through his expression that he did not try to hide. "You look," he began. "Breakfast," she said again, but not harshly. Almost gently, he sat down. They ate in the kind of quiet that had become easy between them, the quiet of two people who had learned each other well enough that silence was not absence but presence. When they were done, Caleb pushed back his chair and stood and looked at her across the table. "Whatever happens today," he said. "Whatever happens today," she agreed. He picked up his hat. They walked out together into the morning. The auction was set for 10 o'clock in the yard of Whitmore Ranch, which meant the town had come out. There was no more accurate way to say it. Every person in Willow Creek who had nothing better to do, and several who did, had found a reason to be present. They stood at the edges of the yard and along the fence line, and some had come in wagons that they parked on the track leading up to the property. Eleanor felt them watching as she and Caleb walked through the gate. She felt them the way she had always felt crowds, as a pressure, as a weather system, as a thing to be walked through rather than around. She walked through them. She found a place to stand near the front, and Caleb stood beside her, and for the first time since she had walked into this yard 6 weeks ago, he stood close enough that she could feel the solidity of him at her side. Pruitt stood at the front with his papers. Bannerman was there too. A large, calm man in a good coat who stood with the ease of someone who expected to win. The bidding opened. It went quickly, too quickly. Pruitt announced the opening figure, and Bannerman's man raised a hand immediately, a confident, pre-planned gesture. And the number moved upward, and Eleanor counted her breaths and kept her hand on the envelope in her dress pocket. All $459 they had managed to scrape together. The saddle sold at the last minute for $4 more than she had expected. Caleb bid. Bannerman bid back without hesitation. The number crossed 462 and kept moving, and Eleanor felt the cold clarity of understanding that this was going to be decided by something other than their savings. And she closed her eyes briefly and opened them and kept standing beside Caleb and kept her chin level. And then a voice from the back of the crowd said, $480. Eleanor turned. She would never afterward be able to explain exactly what she felt in that moment. Surprise was too small a word for it. Recognition was closer, the recognition of something she had not known to look for, something that had been waiting in the story all along for the moment when it was needed. Margaret Linwood was standing at the back of the crowd with a leather bag in her hands. The crowd went so quiet that Eleanor could hear the wind moving through the dry grass beyond the fence line. Margaret Linwood walked forward. She moved through the gathered townspeople the way a woman who has decided something walks, without hurry, without apology, with the particular calm of someone who has been waiting a long time for this exact moment and intends to do it properly. The leather bag in her hands was not small. It had the weight of something that had been saved carefully over a long time for a purpose that was now arriving. Pruitt stared at her. Bannerman's man turned to look. Caleb stood absolutely still at Eleanor's side. "Margaret," Pruitt said, and his voice carried the faint bewilderment of a man whose script had just been rewritten by someone who hadn't been given a copy of it. Are you making a bid?" $480. Margaret said again, clearly. so the whole yard could hear it. She set the leather bag down on the auction table and looked at Pruitt with the expression she reserved for people who had asked her a question she considered self-evident. "That is a number, Gerald, and this is an auction." "Yes, I am making a bid." Bannerman, who had been standing with the ease of a man expecting no real opposition, looked at the leather bag, and then at Margaret and then at Pruitt, and something shifted behind his eyes, not alarm exactly, but the recalculation of a man who has just been surprised. 500, said Bannerman's man. The crowd exhaled. 520, said Margaret, without blinking. Eleanor turned and stared at her. She had known Margaret for 6 weeks. She had worked beside her and eaten at her table, and had the kind of conversations with her that happened between women who respect each other and do not waste words. She had understood Margaret to be a woman of modest and carefully managed means, a widow who kept a boarding house because it was work she could do, and because she was useful at it, not because she was prospering. She had not understood this. 540, said Bannerman's man, and now there was an edge in his voice, the edge of someone who was beginning to understand that the casual victory he had planned was going to cost him more than anticipated. 560, said Margaret. Caleb leaned slightly toward Eleanor. What is she doing? He said very low. I don't know, Eleanor said. And she didn't. Not yet. The bidding went 4 more rounds. Bannerman's man looked back at Bannerman himself after each of Margaret's responses, and each time Bannerman gave a small nod that was getting incrementally less confident, and the man bid again, and Margaret responded without hesitation. Without consulting anything or anyone, as though she had already decided on a number and was simply walking toward it at whatever pace the proceedings required. At $620, Bannerman's man looked back at Bannerman, and Bannerman did not nod. He looked at Margaret for a long moment. He looked at the leather bag. He looked at the crowd that was watching him with the particular intensity of people who had come expecting one story and were now watching a different one unfold, and something in his expression, the ease, the assurance, the settled certainty of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted at these things shifted. He shook his head. His man was silent. Pruitt looked around the yard. $620, he said, going once. Nobody spoke, going twice. The wind moved through the dry grass. Sold, said Pruitt to Margaret Linwood. The crowd broke into sound, not applause exactly, more like the collective release of people who had been holding their breath. A wave of voices and movement, and the particular social noise of a community that has just witnessed something it did not expect and is not quite sure what to make of it. Caleb took one step forward and Eleanor caught his arm. Wait, she said. Margaret just bought my ranch, he said. I know, Eleanor said. Wait. Margaret was completing the transaction with Pruitt, signing what needed to be signed, the leather bag considerably lighter now. When she was done, she turned, and she looked directly at Eleanor and Caleb, and she walked toward them, through the dispersing crowd with the same measured, purposeful pace she had walked in with. Caleb pulled his hat from his head. He did not know what else to do with his hands. Margaret, he said. I don't, ma'am, I don't understand what just happened. I bought your ranch, Margaret said. Yes, ma'am, I can see that. I don't understand why. Margaret looked at him for a moment, and then she looked at Eleanor. And in the look she gave Eleanor, there was something that Eleanor had not seen in it before, a tenderness that had been kept carefully, behind the practicality and the sharpness, saved, apparently, for exactly this moment. Sit down, Caleb, she said. Both of you. There's something I should have told a long time ago. They found 3 chairs, Simeon, brought them from the porch without being asked. The first truly neighborly gesture anyone in Willow Creek had offered the inhabitants of Whitmore Ranch in recent memory, and they sat in a small triangle in the yard while the remaining members of the crowd, those who hadn't drifted away, maintained a respectful distance that still kept them within earshot. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at Eleanor and she began. Your mother, she said, was named Ruth Whitaker. Eleanor went still. Yes, she said, I knew her, Margaret said. Not well, not the way you know someone you've grown up beside. I knew her the way you know someone who does something for you that you can never entirely repay, and so you carry the knowledge of them for the rest of your life, and it changes how you see everything that comes after." Eleanor did not speak. Caleb glanced at her and looked back at Margaret. "This was in the winter of 1861, Margaret said. "I was 27 years old, and I had been married for 3 years, and we had come west the year before with what we had, and the expectation of what that country was supposed to give you, if you worked hard enough. My husband was a good man and a hard worker, and he died of a fever in November of that year. And in December I had $11 and a half finished house and a town full of people who were very sorry for my loss and not in a position to be much more than sorry." She paused. "I was 3 months from losing everything when your mother came to my door," Margaret said. I had never met her before. She was living in the territory at that time. Her husband was alive then, working the mines, and somehow she had heard about my situation. I don't know how. People knew things in small places the way they always know things. She came to my door in a January storm with a wrapped parcel and a basket, and she sat at my table, and she didn't offer me charity." Eleanor's throat moved. "She offered me work," Margaret said. "She knew accounts, the way you know accounts, the way the women in your family seem to know practical things. She connected me with 2 ranchers who needed their books managed, and she vouched for me when I had no standing to be vouched for. And she sat with me on 3 separate occasions in the weeks that followed and taught me what I needed to know to keep myself solvent. And she did it without," Margaret stopped for a moment, "without making me feel like less of a person for needing it." Which was the harder gift? Eleanor pressed her lips together. "She never told me her daughter's name," Margaret said. "Or I didn't retain it, or time took it from me. I knew she had a daughter. And I knew she told me once, just once, that she worried about her daughter. That her daughter was going to have a harder road than most, because the world was going to judge her before it knew her. And she worried about whether she'd managed to give her daughter enough of whatever it was that would keep her going when the world's judgment came." She looked at Eleanor directly. "I'd say she managed," Margaret said. Eleanor looked away. She looked at the ranch yard, the repaired fence, the recovered cattle in the near field, the barn with its door hanging straight on its mended hinge, and she swallowed once, carefully, and looked back at Margaret. "She never said anything," Eleanor said. Her voice was even, barely. "About you, about any of this. That would be like her," Margaret said. "I gathered that about her in the short time I knew her. She didn't do things for the telling of them afterward." She paused. "Neither do you." The crowd that had lingered was very quiet now. Caleb had not moved. He was looking at Eleanor with an expression that was almost painful in its openness, all the careful distance he had maintained for weeks. All the managed reserve of a man who had been protecting himself for so long it had become second nature was simply gone. What was underneath it was not complicated, it was not subtle. It was the face of a man who was watching someone he cared about very much receive something they had not known they were owed. "The ranch papers," Margaret said, and she took them from her coat pocket. Pruitt had been efficient, whatever else he was, and she held them out toward Caleb. He looked at them. He did not take them immediately. "Margaret," he said, I can't accept." "Caleb Whitmore," Margaret said, in the tone of a woman who has made a decision and has absolutely no patience for arguments against it, "I have been waiting 23 years to repay what Ruth Whitaker did for me. I am not asking for your opinion on the matter. I am asking you to take these papers and take care of this land." His jaw worked. "I don't have the words," he said. "You don't need words," she said. "You need to take these papers and make good use of them." He took them. He held them in both hands and looked down at them, and Eleanor watched something happen in his face that she had never seen before. Not the careful control of a man managing his feelings. Not the darkness that came when he thought about what he'd lost, but something raw and undefended and entirely real. "There's one condition," Margaret said. Caleb looked up. "When the time comes," Margaret said, "and it will come when someone in this territory needs the kind of help that can't be bought and can only be given, I want you to give it. Both of you." She looked at Eleanor. "The way your mother gave it. without expecting anything back, without making the person feel less for needing it. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said, and his voice was not entirely steady. Eleanor said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "She would have liked you, Margaret." Margaret stood up and smoothed her coat. "I know," she said simply. "I liked her too." She walked away through the yard and the crowd parted for her. And several people who had been watching with the careful attention of those witnessing something important stepped back and looked at the ground in the way of people who are privately revising the story they had come here expecting to see. Eleanor sat in her chair and did not move. Caleb sat across from her with the ranch papers in his hands. For a long moment neither of them said anything. Then Caleb said quietly, "Eleanor." She looked at him. "Ask me now," he said. She blinked. "The auction just ended 30 seconds ago, I know," he said. "Ask me now. Or let me ask you. I don't want to wait anymore." She looked at him across the 3 feet of space between their chairs, in the middle of the yard where his ranch had just been bought and given back to him, with half of Willow Creek somewhere behind them, pretending not to listen. "You said you'd ask me when it cost you nothing to let me go," she said. "It will always cost me something to let you go," he said. "That's the point. I understand that now." He leaned forward slightly. "Eleanor, will you stay?" She looked at him for a long moment. The crowd behind them was extraordinarily quiet for so many people. "Yes," she said. He exhaled a long, slow exhale that carried 6 weeks of careful distance and 2 months of fever, and a year of believing he had nothing left to offer anyone, and she heard all of those things in it. "Yes," she said again. "More certainly." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she let him, and neither of them said anything else for a moment because nothing else was immediately required. Then from somewhere in the remaining crowd came the sound of Holt from the general store, a gruff man not given to sentiment clearing his throat and saying, with visible effort, "Well, somebody ought to congratulate them," and to Eleanor's considerable surprise, somebody did. Not everyone. Not the men who had laughed on the road, or the women who had whispered at the laundry. But several people, more than she had expected. A ranch wife from the north end of the valley pressed her hand and said something genuine and brief. An older man she didn't know tipped his hat to Caleb with an expression of honest respect. Even Holt himself crossed the yard and offered his hand and said he'd be glad of their business and meant it. It was not a transformation. The people of Willow Creek were not, in the space of one auction, going to become different people than they had been. But something had shifted. The way the weight shifts in a room when the person everyone has been underestimating does the thing that cannot be argued with, and the room has to adjust itself accordingly. Eleanor was under no illusion that this was the end of the difficult parts. But it was something. They walked back into the house together, in the late afternoon, and Caleb set the ranch papers on the table, his kitchen table. His table. The table they had sat at every night for 6 weeks, going over ledgers and eating supper and talking until the fire burned low, and he stood looking at them for a moment. "Reckon we have a lot of work to do," he said. "We always have a lot of work to do," Eleanor said. "Yeah." He looked at her, and there was something in his face now that had not been there before. Not relief exactly, but the absence of the darkness that had been living there since Clara left, since the injury, since the slow catastrophe of the months before Eleanor arrived. Its absence left room for something else, something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like a man beginning to believe again in the possibility of things going right. "Reckon I'm glad of the company." "Reckon I am's too," she said, and the words were simpler than everything underneath them, and both of them knew it. She put the kettle on. He sat at the table and looked at the papers. Outside, the evening was coming in over the mountains. But the work was not over. That was the thing that Eleanor had known all along. Even in the moments that felt most like endings, the real work was only beginning. Because keeping something was harder than saving it in a crisis. Saving something in a crisis had the momentum of emergency, the clarity of a single urgent task. Keeping something required the long, unglamorous commitment of every ordinary day. The next morning proved it. She woke to find Caleb at the table already, not with coffee but with paper and pencil, working through calculations she recognized as cattle feed costs projected through winter. She stood in the doorway for a moment watching him, a man doing the math of a future he believed in again. And then she said his name and he looked up and she said, "The south fence needs attention before the cold comes. I did a walk yesterday and there are 2 posts that won't survive a hard winter." "I know about the posts," he said. "I was thinking we replace them and run a second strand of wire along the bottom while we're at it." "That's more expensive," she said. "That's also the right call," he said. Cheaper to do it once than twice, she considered this. "You're right," she said. He looked very slightly pleased with himself in the way he always did when she agreed with him, which she found both transparent and endearing, and chose not to comment on. "I'll go into town today," she said. "Talk to Holt about the wire. And I want to speak with Mrs. Dunn." "You're going back to the laundry," he said. His voice was carefully neutral. "I'm going to explain to Mrs. Dunn that I won't be coming back," she said. "She deserves to hear it in person rather than just not see me Monday morning." He looked at her. "You're not obligated to explain anything to anyone," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to." He nodded once slowly and went back to his calculations. Mrs. Dunn took the news with the practical efficiency she applied to everything. "I expected as much," she said when Eleanor stood in the laundry doorway and explained. After yesterday, she looked Eleanor over with her sharp, assessing gaze. "You did good work here, better than most I've had." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "It's not a compliment, Mrs. Dunn said, which was, Eleanor had learned exactly how she issued compliments. "It's an observation. You know where I am if the ranch doesn't work out." "I do," Eleanor said. "Good." Mrs. Dunn picked up her tongs and went back to her work, and Eleanor stood in the doorway for another moment and then walked out into the main street of Willow Creek. The town looked different to her now. Not different in any physical sense. It was the same dusty main street it had been the day she arrived, the same general store and the same church, and the same saloon doing its brisk business at a socially inconvenient hour. But it had acquired a texture it had lacked before. She knew the names of things and the histories of places and the stories beneath the surfaces that frontier towns showed to newcomers. She knew which families were struggling and which were prospering, and who had been kind and who had not. She was not invisible here anymore. That was the change. She had stopped being the woman nobody wanted and become, in the complicated, gradual, and imperfect way that communities absorb new people, a person with a specific gravity, a recognizable weight in the social fabric of the place. 2 women she recognized from the ranch wife's circle greeted her on the main street. One of them said something about the auction in a tone that was not quite an apology, but was trying to be in the vicinity of one. Eleanor accepted it without making it more or less than it was. She collected the wire from Holt, who charged her a fair price without the slight hesitation he had always shown before, and she walked back to the ranch. Caleb was in the south field when she got there. She could see him from the gate, working along the fence line, checking posts. She stood at the gate for a moment watching him, a man working his own land, a man who had decided to keep going, and then she walked out to join him. They spent the afternoon at the fence. It was the 3rd fence they had worked on together, and by now the rhythm of it was easy, each of them knowing, without being told which task needed doing, each of them adjusting to the other's pace without negotiation. She held the wire and he drove the posts, and then they reversed and the fence grew stronger in both directions from wherever they started. Holt mentioned something, Caleb said, when they had reached the far end of the south fence and were assessing the last section. "What did he say?" "There's a family coming in from Kansas," Caleb said. "Husband and wife and 2 sons coming to homestead. They have the land grant but not much else, no equipment, no cattle, no real knowledge of what they're walking into." Eleanor looked at him. "Margaret's condition," she said. "Yes," he said. She thought about it. "When do they arrive?" she said. "End of the month," he said. Holt said the husband came through last week scouting, and he looked. Caleb paused. "He looked the way I looked, probably before you walked through my door. Like a man who has committed himself to something, and is only now beginning to understand the full weight of what he's committed to. Eleanor looked out at the fence line. "We have the old equipment in the north barn," she said. "The hand tools, the seed stock from the kitchen garden. We're not going to use it all ourselves, no," he said. "And I know the accounts well enough to spend a morning showing someone how to keep them," she said. "If that would help." "It would help," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at her sideways, the particular look she had come to know as the one that came before he said something he had already decided to say and was only confirming the decision one last time. "You know what you are," he said. "I'm holding a fence stretcher in my cracked hands in the last of the afternoon light," she said. "I know exactly what I am. You're the best person I've ever known," he said. It was said simply, without performance, the way the true things tend to get said without ceremony, in the middle of ordinary work. Eleanor looked at the fence. "That's a high bar," she said. "Not from where I'm standing," he said. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the directness that had become one of the things she valued most about him. That when Caleb Whitmore decided to see something, he looked at it entirely, without flinching, without the sideways glance of someone managing their own discomfort. He was looking at her that way now. "You should probably know," she said, and her voice was not entirely as steady as she usually kept it, "that this is not something I had planned on." "What isn't?" "This," she said, with a small gesture that encompassed, somewhat inadequately, the fence and the ranch and him and all of it. "When I bought my train ticket, I was being practical. I was solving a problem. I was not planning to—" She stopped. "To what?" he said. "To find that the problem had a heart in it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then quietly I found that too." She looked away first this time. "Finish the fence, Caleb," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but had the warmth of one. He finished the fence. That evening, when the work was done and the supper was over, and they were sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, Caleb reached into his coat pocket and put something on the table between them. It was a ring, simple, plain silver. Not new, she could see it had been cleaned recently carefully, but it carried the small signs of age. He put it on the table, and he looked at her across the lamp. "This was my mother's," he said. "My father gave it to her the day he finished building this house. He said it was the only promise he was sure he could keep, that he would always have a house for her to come home to." Eleanor looked at the ring. "It went to Clara when we married," Caleb said. "She left it when she went, put it on the table just like this. I kept it because," he paused. "I don't know why I kept it exactly. I think maybe because getting rid of it would have meant something I wasn't ready to mean." He looked at her. "Eleanor Whitaker," he said, "I know it's early. I know we have 30 years of things to figure out, and I know I am not an easy man, and I know this ranch is more work than any two people have a right to take on. And I know that I started this about as wrong as a man can start something." She said nothing. "But I would like very much," he said, "to start the next part right." The lamp made its small, steady light between them. Outside, the night was quiet over Whitmore Ranch, the ranch that had been lost and found and given back and now sat in the dark wearing its mended fences and its repaired barn door and its recovered cattle like a man who has been through something terrible and come out the other side still standing. Eleanor looked at the ring. She looked at Caleb. She thought about her mother, who had walked into a stranger's door in a January storm because someone needed help, and she was the one who was there to give it. Who had done it without making the person feel less for needing it. Who had never said a word about it afterward. She reached across the table and picked up the ring. "Ask me properly," she said. He looked at her, and the seriousness in his face broke slightly at the edges, and what came through was something she had only seen in pieces before: the man underneath the broken cowboy. The man who had built things and loved them and was ready, maybe, to try again. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Yes," she said. She put the ring on her own finger. He would have done it, but she was a practical woman and she wanted to know it fit, and it did. "Good," he said. His voice was not steady. He did not appear to notice. "Good," she agreed. The lamp burned between them. The clock ticked on the wall. And Whitmore Ranch held them both in the dark, solid and certain and mended, the way a thing feels when it has been through the worst of it and is still standing when the people inside it have decided fully, finally, without reservation to stay. The wedding was on a Saturday. Not because Saturday was special, but because it was the day that Caleb finished repairing the last section of the north fence and came inside with his hands dirty and his jaw set with the particular satisfaction of completed work and said, "Eleanor, I don't want to wait any longer." And Eleanor looked up from the bread she was shaping and said, "Then don't." And that was how the decision got made. Margaret Linwood witnessed it. Holt from the general store came, which surprised Eleanor and did not surprise her at the same time. Holt had been quietly shifting his position on the matter of Eleanor Whittaker since the auction, in the slow, private way that stubborn men revise their opinions when they have been demonstrably wrong about something. The preacher came because that was his function, and he performed it without the commentary he had been offering freely to anyone who would listen in the weeks prior about the peculiarity of the arrangement. It was not a large ceremony. It was a real one. Eleanor wore her better dress, the same one she had worn to the auction, and Caleb wore his clean shirt and the hat he kept for occasions. And they stood in the front room of Whitmore Ranch and said the words in front of 4 people and the clock on the wall that ticked through all of it, with its steady, ordinary indifference to the significance of moments. When it was done, Holt shook Caleb's hand and said, "You did better than you deserved." And Caleb said, "I know it." And they both looked at Eleanor. And Eleanor said, "Stop discussing me like I'm not standing here." And Holt laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him. And that was the moment, Eleanor would think later, that she understood she had become a person in Willow Creek rather than a story. Margaret stayed after the others left. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and looked at Eleanor with the expression she wore when she was about to say something she had been composing for a while. "Your mother would have liked him," she said. Eleanor looked at Caleb, who was outside on the porch talking with the preacher about the fence-building techniques of the early territory, which was the kind of conversation that could only happen at a wedding in a frontier town. "I think she would have argued with him constantly," Eleanor said. "Yes," Margaret said, "that's why she would have liked him." She finished her coffee and stood and put on her coat and looked at Eleanor one final time with the look that was not warmth exactly, but had all of warmth's substance packed into something more durable. "You did a good thing here, Eleanor," she said, "a hard one. And you did it without losing yourself in the middle of it." "I tried," Eleanor said. "You did better than tried," Margaret said. "That's the thing about you. You always do better than tried." She left. Eleanor stood in her kitchen. The word still carried a small, quiet shock when it arrived fully in her mind, and listened to Caleb's voice on the porch talking about fence posts. And she felt the particular sensation of a life settling into its real shape. Not the shape she had imagined in Chicago, a better one. The Kansas family arrived on the last Thursday of the month. Their name was Garvey Thomas and Miriam, and their 2 sons, who were 8 and 11, and had the particular combination of exhaustion and wide-eyed alertness of children who have traveled far and are not yet sure whether the place they have arrived is safe. They came with a wagon that had clearly been overloaded for too long, a team of horses that needed rest, and the specific expression of people who have been sustaining themselves on determination, and are discovering that determination, while necessary, does not build fence posts or show you where the water table sits. Caleb had ridden out to meet them on the road. Eleanor heard them coming before she saw them, the wagon wheels on the track, the horses, the sound of a family in motion, and she went to the gate. Thomas Garvey was a broad man in his late 30s with honest eyes, and the hands of someone who had worked hard at things that had not always worked out. He looked at the ranch as he pulled in, and then he looked at Caleb, and then he looked at Eleanor, and his expression did the quick, complicated calculation of a man trying to figure out whether the help being offered was real. Eleanor recognized that calculation. She had done it herself. "Mr. Garvey," she said, "you look like you could use a meal." He looked at his wife, and his wife, a small, dark-haired woman with a spine like iron, who had clearly been holding the family together, since Kansas, looked at Eleanor, with the expression of someone who was about 2 days away from her limit and knew it. "We could," Miriam Garvey said. "Come in then," Eleanor said. What happened over the next 3 hours was something Eleanor had not planned on but should have expected. Because she had been in exactly that kitchen not so many weeks ago, herself hungry and uncertain and trying not to show how close to the edge she was standing. She fed them and she listened to Thomas talk about the land grant and the things he didn't know, and she watched Caleb do what she had done, ask questions about the man's knowledge and skills with genuine interest. Treat his answers like they mattered. Make him feel like a man who had something real to offer, rather than a man who was failing to do the thing he had set out to do. "You know horses," Caleb said, partway through the meal. It was not a question. She could hear that. He had been paying attention. "Yes," Thomas said, with the caution of someone who has been wrong before about whether knowing a thing matters. "I have a problem with the team in my south pasture," Caleb said. "The lead animal is favoring her left front leg, and I haven't been able to determine why. If you'd look at her tomorrow morning, I'd be grateful." Thomas straightened slightly, just slightly, the way a man does when he is offered the thing he is actually good at. "I can do that," he said. Miriam Garvey looked across the table at Eleanor with an expression that needed no translation. After supper, Eleanor showed Miriam the kitchen garden, what she had planted late in the season, and what had come up and what they had dried for winter stores, and she explained the things she had learned about what grew in this soil and what didn't, and which suppliers in town were fair and which required watching. "You've only been here since summer," Miriam said. "Since July," Eleanor said. Miriam looked at the garden and back at Eleanor. "How did you learn all this so fast?" "I paid attention," Eleanor said. "And I made a lot of mistakes and fixed them. You'll do the same." Miriam was quiet for a moment. "We don't have much to offer in return," she said. The words cost her something. Eleanor could hear the price of them. "You're not here to offer anything in return," Eleanor said. "You're here because you needed a meal and someone to show you where the water table sits. That's all." Miriam looked at her. "Why?" she said. The same question Eleanor had been asked, in different words, by different people, since July. "Because someone did it for me," Eleanor said, "and someone did it for them. That's how it works if you do it right." Miriam was quiet for a long moment. "All right," she said finally. "All right," Eleanor agreed. The Garveys stayed 2 nights and left on the 3rd morning with a load of seed stock from Eleanor's stores, the hand tools from the north barn, 2 hours of account-keeping instruction at the kitchen table, and directions to the water on their land that Caleb had ridden out to scout the previous afternoon. Thomas Garvey shook Caleb's hand at the gate and held it a moment longer than a formal handshake required. "I don't know how to," he began. "You'll know the right time," Caleb said. "When someone else needs it." Thomas nodded. The wagon moved up the track and Eleanor and Caleb stood at the gate watching it go, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Margaret would approve," Eleanor said. "I reckon she would," Caleb said. He put his arm around her shoulders, the first time he had done that, a casual, settled gesture that had not been possible between them before. That belonged to the category of small things that mean very large things, and she let the weight of it be what it was. "We have a lot of work to do," she said. "We always have a lot of work to do," he said, which was what she had said to him once, weeks ago, and the fact that he had kept it and offered it back to her now was the kind of thing that told her, more than any speech could have, that he had been paying attention all along. "Come on then," she said. They went back to work. The winter came early that year, the way winters in the territory tended to come when they had a point to make hard and fast, with a first snowfall in October that left no ambiguity about what the following months would require. Eleanor had spent September preparing for it, which meant Caleb had spent September watching Eleanor prepare for it, and doing the things she pointed him toward, and occasionally arguing with her about strategy, and being wrong about half the time, and right about the other half, which she considered a reasonable average. The cattle were wintered in the lower pasture, where the land broke the worst of the wind. The stores were stacked in the north barn in the order Eleanor had determined was most efficient for access during the months, when efficiencies in small things was the difference between a difficult winter and a dangerous one. The fence lines held because they had spent 3 weeks reinforcing them. The first hard week of the cold found them tested in ways they had not entirely anticipated. The water pump in the yard froze on a Monday morning, and Caleb spent 3 hours in the cold working it free while Eleanor heated water on the stove and carried it out to him in intervals. And somewhere in the second hour he came inside briefly to warm his hands and looked at her with an expression of a combined misery and determination and said, "I should have wrapped the housing before the freeze." And she said yes. And he said, "You told me to." And she said yes. And he said, "You're not going to let me forget that." And she said, "I won't need to. You'll remember it yourself." And he went back outside and finished the job. 2 days later, the pump froze again. He came inside and did not say anything, and went directly to the stove and stood there warming his hands, and Eleanor set a coffee cup on the table without comment, and he sat down and wrapped both hands around it. "I wrapped the housing," he said. "I know," she said. The cold went past what the wrapping was built for. "It's not the same thing as not doing it." He looked at her. "How do you do that?" he said. "Do what? Know the difference," he said. "Between a mistake and something that was done right and went wrong anyway." She sat down across from him. "My mother taught me," she said. She said the hardest thing a person learns is not to confuse bad luck with bad character. Most people spend their whole lives doing one or the other. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Clara used to," he began, and then stopped. She waited. "When things went wrong on the ranch," he said, "Clara used to look at me like it was evidence of something. Like each thing that went wrong was proof of a case she was building." He paused. "I started believing the case. That's the danger of someone else's story about you," Eleanor said. "If they tell it long enough, you start telling it yourself." "Yes," he said, "you're not that story," she said. He looked at her directly. "No," he said, "I know that now." She stood and went back to the stove. "Tomorrow we need to insulate the pump housing differently," she said. "I have an idea about it." "Tell me," he said. She told him. He argued with one part of it. She considered his argument and revised that part. The new insulation held for the rest of the winter. January brought something none of their practical preparation had covered a week of weather so severe that the ranch was effectively cut off from town. And for 7 days it was only the two of them, and the animals and the supplies they had laid in, and the particular test of two people confined together by circumstance, with nowhere to go and no distraction from whatever was actually between them. Eleanor had been a little afraid of that. Not of Caleb. She trusted him in the way she trusted the fence posts they had driven together, thoroughly and based on evidence. She had been afraid of herself, of what she might discover about what she wanted, when wanting was no longer complicated by necessity. She discovered she wanted exactly this. The 7th evening of the storm she was sitting by the lamp with her mending, and Caleb was at the table with his account books. He had taken over the accounts himself in November. Learning from her the way she had offered to teach anyone who needed it, and he was good at it in the careful, thorough way he was good at most things once he decided to be, and the wind was doing its serious work outside, and the stove was holding, and the room was warm and quiet with the specific warmth and quiet that belongs to a place that is genuinely inhabited. "Eleanor," Caleb said without looking up from the accounts. She said. "I was wrong about something," he said. He still did not look up. She looked up from her mending. "Just one thing," she said. He did look up then, and there was that edge of warmth in his expression that she had come to love. The place where his seriousness and his humor existed in proximity and occasionally let each other through. "One specific thing," he said, "that I haven't said directly." She put down her mending. "When I turned my horse on that platform," he said, "I told myself it was because I was protecting you from disappointment. That you'd be better off knowing immediately rather than later. That I was being honest." "You weren't," she said. "No," he said, "I was being a coward. I was protecting myself from the possibility that you'd leave eventually the way Clara left." So I left first. He looked at the account book and then at her. I called it honesty and it was cowardice, and I want to say that plainly. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. I know you know, he said. I wanted to say it plainly anyway. So it's been said between us. Clearly, she picked up her mending again. It's been said, she confirmed. All right, he said, and went back to the accounts. She sewed for another moment. Caleb, she said, yes. I was afraid too, she said, when I walked up that road to your ranch. I was afraid I was doing something desperate and calling it brave. He was quiet. Were you? He said. Both, she said. It was both. Desperate and brave, they're not mutually exclusive. No, he said, I reckon they're not. The storm continued outside. The lamp burned between them, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed to be said. The thing that had needed to be placed in the open between them had been placed there, and they were both the kind of people who, once a thing was done, moved on without requiring it to be done again. The spring came the way springs in the territory always came, abruptly, with the particular violence of seasons that do not transition gradually but simply arrive. As though the land had been holding its breath through the cold and finally released it all at once. The snow went fast, the ground came back, the cattle moved out to the far pasture, and the kitchen garden plot showed its first green within a week of the thaw. Eleanor stood at the garden early one April morning and looked at what was coming up. She thought about July. She thought about walking up this same ground for the first time, with her heart doing something she had not let it do in a long time, hoping, and finding a ruin instead of a ranch and a dying man who told her to leave. She thought about all the things she had not known then that she knew now. Caleb came up beside her. He stood looking at the garden with his coffee in his hand, and his coat open to the spring air and the easy, settled presence of a man in a place that belonged to him, not in the claiming sense, but in the belonging sense, the deeper sense. The sense in which a person and a place have shaped each other until they fit. Good yield this year, he said, if the weather holds. It'll hold, she said. He looked at her sideways. You can't know that, he said. I know it, she said. He made the sound that was not quite a laugh. Reckon I believe you, he said. She looked at the garden. In the weeks that followed, something began to happen in Willow Creek that Eleanor did not immediately recognize as a pattern because it happened slowly and without announcement. People came to the ranch, not to look, not to whisper or assess or form opinions, but for actual purposes, the kind of purpose that required showing up at someone's gate and asking for help. A young woman came first. She was perhaps 22, recently arrived in the territory, recently abandoned by the man she had come to marry, a situation close enough to Eleanor's own arrival that Eleanor recognized it without being told. She came to the gate with a single bag and the particular expression Eleanor knew well, controlled, braced, refusing to be what people expected her to be, while also not entirely certain she could maintain that refusal indefinitely. Eleanor opened the gate. Come in, she said. I'll put the kettle on. The young woman's name was Ada. She stayed 3 weeks, sleeping in the room at the back of the barn that Eleanor had once used herself. She was good with horses, which Caleb discovered on the second day and immediately found useful, and she was less good with accounts but willing to learn. And by the 3rd week she had 3 job offers in town, because Eleanor had asked the right questions of the right people. She left with a plan. She left standing straight. How do you know who to help? Caleb asked that evening. Out of everyone who might come. Eleanor thought about it seriously. I look for the people who are still standing when they have no good reason to be, she said. Those are the ones who just need something to push against. He looked at her. Like you, he said. Like me, she agreed. A ranching family came in May with a sick horse and a question about winter feed storage that they had been too proud to ask anyone in town, because asking in town meant admitting they didn't know, and admitting you didn't know in a territory where competence was currency was a social cost some people couldn't afford. Caleb answered the question about the horse, and Eleanor answered the question about the feed, and they sent the family home with both answers and a sack of dried beans from the stores because it was apparent the family needed them. And neither Eleanor nor Caleb mentioned it directly. Thomas Garvey came in June. He rode up the track on a horse that was clearly the one he had told them about last fall, well chosen, well kept, the horse of a man who knew horses and had been doing right by this one. And he came to the gate, and Caleb went out to meet him. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window. She could not hear what they said. She saw Caleb's expression move through several things and settle into something warm and unguarded. She saw Thomas Garvey reach into his saddlebag and pull out something wrapped in cloth and hand it to Caleb. And Caleb looked at it for a moment, before looking back at Thomas, with the particular expression of a man who has been given something he didn't know he needed. When Caleb came back inside, he was carrying a small carved figure, a horse, carefully made, clearly by someone who had spent real time and care on it, and he set it on the kitchen table and looked at Eleanor. He said his boy made it, Caleb said, the older one. Said he wanted to give us something real. Eleanor looked at the carved horse. Put it on the mantel, she said. He did. It sat there for the rest of the year and the years after it, and Eleanor would look at it sometimes and think about the chain of things: her mother in a January storm, Margaret with a leather bag, Eleanor with a wooden trunk, Thomas Garvey with a saddlebag, an 11-year-old boy with a carving knife, and how the only thing connecting all of them was the simple decision, made over and over in different circumstances by different people, to show up when someone needed showing up for. Summer came back. It was not the same summer it had been a year before. Nothing was the same, and Eleanor was glad of it in the specific way you are glad when difficult things are genuinely behind you, rather than just temporarily out of sight. The ranch was stronger. The cattle numbers had recovered past what Caleb had held before the injury. Because Eleanor had been rigorous about the breeding records, and Caleb had found a buyer in Denver who paid better than Holt's contact, and the deal had been built into something reliable. The south barn was fully repaired. The north fence line had been entirely redone properly this time, with the right posts at the right depth. The kitchen garden was the best it had been since before Clara left, by Caleb's reckoning, and he said so one evening in August when they were putting up the last of the summer stores. Eleanor said. Before Clara, he said. He said her name the way he said it now, without the weight it used to carry, without the shape of an old wound. Just a fact, a piece of chronology. It was like this the first summer I worked it myself after my father died. Before I stopped paying attention to it. You're paying attention now, Eleanor said. Hard not to, he said, when you're standing right here telling me what it needs. She passed him a jar to seal and he sealed it. Caleb, she said. Are you happy? She said. He looked up. It was a direct question and she was watching him directly, the way she watched everything fully, without flinching, with the attention of someone who wanted the real answer rather than the convenient one. He thought about it. She appreciated that he thought about it genuinely rather than answering immediately in the way that meant he hadn't considered it. Yes, he said, I am. He paused. I didn't know if I was going to be able to say that again. Mean it, I mean, I know, she said. Are you, he said. She looked at the jars lined up on the shelf, the full stores, the kitchen that was her kitchen, the ranch that was her ranch. The man standing across from her who had turned his horse away from her on a platform, and then spent a year learning what it meant that she had come back anyway. Yes, she said, more than I knew to want. He was quiet for a moment. Your mother would be proud of you, he said. Eleanor looked at the shelf. I know, she said. She said it without qualification, and without the careful deflection she might have offered a year ago, because she had learned slowly, through the particular curriculum of building a life in honest partnership with someone who saw her clearly, that accepting a true thing as true was not arrogance. It was just accuracy. That evening Margaret came for supper. She came most Sunday evenings by then, and the arrangement had the comfortable solidity of something that had established itself without being formally decided. Margaret ate, arriving, Eleanor cooking, Caleb asking Margaret's opinion on things he respected her judgment on, and occasionally arguing with her conclusions, which Margaret found either annoying or gratifying, depending on whether he was right. Tonight he was right about something, and Margaret spent 3 full minutes making clear that she acknowledged it, while also making that the specific circumstances were unusual and should not be taken as indicative of a general pattern. Eleanor listened to them argue and felt something she had not felt in this quality before. Not contentment, which was too passive a word for it, but something more active. The feeling of a life that was genuinely hers, built by her own hands and her own choices, populated by real people who saw her and stayed. After supper, Margaret sat on the porch with her coffee, and Eleanor came out and sat beside her, and they looked at the ranch in the evening light. The mended fences, the full barn, the south pasture where the cattle moved in the long shadows. "I want to ask you something," Eleanor said. "Ask," Margaret said. "That first day," Eleanor said, "when I came to your door. Why did you let me in?" Margaret held her coffee cup and looked at the ranch. "Because you knocked," she said, "and you were still standing up." Eleanor looked at her. "That's all?" she said. "That's everything," Margaret said. "Most people, by the time they've been through what you'd been through that day, the platform, the town, all of it, they knock on a door already half collapsed. You knocked on mine like you still believed something was worth asking for." Eleanor looked at the ranch. "I almost didn't," she said. "Knock, I know," Margaret said, "but you did." Caleb came out and sat on the step below them, and the three of them were quiet together in the way that people who know each other well are quiet. Not because there is nothing to say, but because what is between them does not always require saying. Below them, the ranch went about its evening. The cattle settled. The barn went quiet. The last of the summer light moved off the mountains, and the first of the evening stars came out over the territory, and Eleanor sat between her husband and the woman who had opened a door when all the other doors were closed, and she felt the full, true weight of the life she had built here. Not light, not easy, not perfect, but entirely and irreversibly real. The woman who had arrived in Willow Creek with a wooden trunk and nowhere to go had stayed. She had chosen at every fence post, every cracked hand, every evening at the kitchen table with the ledger between them, every difficult conversation said plainly and received honestly. She had chosen it, and she had built it, and it was hers. Hers, not because the world had finally decided she deserved it. Because she had never once stopped believing she did.